Section 1 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Noah's Ark by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. The Warning. In the early days of the world lived the patriarch Noah, a good and venerable man whose years already numbered 600. Now Noah was warned that a great flood was to come, which would pour down from the clouds and drown the whole earth. He straightway told his neighbors what was to happen, but they refused to believe, and scoffed at him, and said, "Let it rain." Chapter 2. Building the Ark. Then Noah went his way, and set to work to build him a great ship, to be ready for the day of deluge. And he laid the keel in the pasture fields among the daisies, while the idlers came to look on and laugh at such folly, a ship for a rainy day. Chapter 3. Labor Troubles. But Noah knew that he was right, and kept on. And the ship rose, but troubles arose too. For frequent and grievous strikes delayed him, and his workmen clamored for more pay, and stoned those who would work. And Noah bargained with them, and started afresh, for he feared that the rain might come before he was ready. Chapter 4. Painting the Ark. At last, after many days, the ship was finished. Then Noah tarred the inside and the outside to keep it tight, and he named it the Ark, and painted it with colors, for Noah was proud of his work. Chapters 5 and 6. Assembling the Animals. Then Noah went abroad and called together all the animals, by twos, and told them that they must come into the ark to be saved from the deluge. But they too doubted, and were slow to decide, for they feared to enter the dark ship. And they grumbled and said, "It may be but a shower." And though Noah argued with them, and explained all the terrible possibilities of the case, still they hesitated, and in their different tongues and ways talked it over, and would not be hurried. Then Noah called them stumbling blocks, but even this did not move them. Chapter 7. Going on board. And Noah was vexed, and left them, and began to drive his domestic animals on board, hoping to set the others an example. And his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, helped him, while he kept count. Chapter 8. Confusion. Then new troubles began, for now the other beasts and birds, fearing to be left behind, all tried to get in at once, and could not be controlled. But they did not leave behind their dislikes and ancient feuds, for how could the cats and the mice live together in peace? Or how could the fox and the geese agree? And the hounds and the hares? And quarrels and dissensions came into the ark, and confusion reigned. And Noah lost count, and lost patience as well. Chapters 9 and 10. The Procession. But after much trouble, order was established, and the mighty procession, once started, filed steadily in. And they came from far and near, a great host of beasts and birds and creeping things. The big elephant and the polar bear, the giraffe and the striped tiger, and the woolly bison of the west. And from the mountain and the jungle, the hill and the plain, came great and small. And the earth trembled with their tread, while the sky was dark with flapping wings. Chapter 11. The Dinosaur's Dilemma. And then came even the huge dinosaurs, for in those days were mighty beasts. But they were too big for the door, and could not squeeze in. Now Noah sorely regretted this miscalculation, but could find no way to help it, and the dinosaurs, alas, had to be left behind. Chapter 12. Those who would not go in. But the mammoth and the mastodon, and the dinotherium, the paleotherium, and the anoptherium, and the pterodactyl, and the archaeopteryx, and a host of other strange beasts and birds with long Latin names, refused to go in at all, in spite of Noah's warnings. All these, of course, were doomed to be lost, and become fossils, to be put in museums with stones and labels. Chapter 3. Taking in supplies. Then Noah took on board in plenty foods of every kind for men and beasts, while the hungry animals inside complained that he should have done this first instead of last. And then he took his wife and his sons' wives into the ark, though Mrs. Noah was loath and rebelled, for the domestic arrangements, she said, are impossible. Chapter 14. Waiting for the rain. And now All being at last ready, the sun still shone, and the rain did not come. And they waited and waited. And the scoffers laughed and jeered, and called to Noah that it was going to be a dry season. And Noah was sore perplexed, and marveled, though never doubting. Chapter 15. The Rain. But at last the rain did come, and beat down upon the scoffers, and they were wet. And Noah's sons and their wives triumphed, and even the animals were pleased. But Noah felt only sorrow for his stubborn neighbors, for he knew that much more rain would fall. Chapter 16. The Deluge. And then for 40 days and 40 nights it rained hard, and the clouds were rent asunder, and a mighty deluge flooded the whole earth. And the waters rose and covered the trees, and then the hills and mountains, till no dry land might anywhere be seen. But the ark was lifted up, and floated safely away on a stormy sea. Chapter 17. Inside the ark. Now inside the storm-tossed ship was much discomfort and grievous trouble, and many even regretted that they had been saved. For lo, they said, nothing could be worse than this. And Noah's heart was heavy. Chapter 18. Life at Sea. But when the storm was past, and the good ship floated on an even keel, they felt better, and settled down to their new life. And the animals took a keen interest in the passenger list, to find their own names, as passengers always do. And lazy days slipped quietly by, and the stout ark drifted slowly on her way. Chapter 19. Homesickness. But alas, this could not last, for as the days dragged on, and they found themselves still shut up and afloat, they brooded and grew low in their minds. And a great homesickness and longing for a change of any kind came over them. And a wail of despair went up from the ark, and the roof leaked, and all was gloom. And life became a burden to the Noah family. Chapter 20. Strained relations. And then patience and good temper deserted the ark, and the animals fretted and quarreled, and there was riot and disorder and furious battle. And Noah's task grew even harder, and his load heavier to bear. Chapter 21. The raven is sent out. Now Noah became desperate, and something had to be done. So he sent off a raven to bring tidings from the outer world. But the raven, once free, had no thought of returning, and flew far away, saying to himself, "Never again will I be caught in that trap." And Noah waited for news, but none came. Chapter 22. Return of the dove. Then, as matters grew worse, Noah sent forth a dove. She is a gentle bird, and will surely come again to her home, he thought. And the dove did return, for she found only water, and no rest for her foot. Then Noah waited 7 days, and again sent her out. And she came back, bringing in her beak a twig from the olive tree. And all welcomed her with joy, for now they knew that the waters were falling. Chapter 23. First sight of land. Then Noah waited still another 7 days, and again sent out the dove, but this time she did not come back. And Noah climbed to his skylight, and lifted it up, and looked out. And behold, the earth had risen from the waters, still damp, but yet solid earth. And Noah passed along the good word, and in the ark was great excitement, and hope revived. Chapter 24. Leaving the ark. And soon the good ship thumped and bumped, and struck bottom. And though she landed at an uncomfortable angle on a mountain top, they knew that at last the great cruise was ended. And Noah opened the door, and let down the gangplank. And beasts and birds surged out on the desolate rock, and though the mud was thick and heavy, some found it to their liking, and all preferred it to the ship. Chapters 25 and 26. The Rainbow. Now the sun again arose, and sucked up the dampness from the earth, and a bright rainbow was set in the sky, as a sign that nevermore would a flood cover the whole earth. Then spring burst forth, with all its glory and promise, and a new world began, and all was life and joy. And Noah bade the beasts and birds go forth and seek new homes, and they scattered in every direction to begin life afresh, while Noah's wife murmured good riddance, and vowed that she would never go to sea again. Then Noah gladly rested from his labors. And this is the end of the story of Noah's Ark. Section 2 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Pocahontas and Captain John Smith by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter I. Pocahontas. Long, long ago, when the Indians owned the land, there lived in Virginia, near the river afterwards called the James, a little girl, the Princess Pocahontas, daughter of the great chief Powhatan. Pocahontas was her father's favorite child, and the pet of the whole tribe. Even the fierce warriors loved her sunny ways. She was a child of nature, and the birds trusted her and came to her call. She knew their songs and where they built their nests. So she roamed the woods and learned the ways of all the wild things, and grew to be a carefree maiden. Chapter II. John Smith. In far-away England was a doughty youth, John Smith, who dreamed of battle and adventure. Though but a boy, he had already fought as a soldier in the wars of France and later in Flanders. And these two, the wild little Indian girl and the warrior boy, now so far apart, in time were to meet and become great friends. At home again in Lincolnshire after dangerous travels, the youth still longed for the strife and glory of the fray. He retired to a quiet spot in the wood, and lived in a camp of his own making, where he read tales of war and knights errant, and in his enthusiasm fought imaginary enemies. At last he could bear dreaming no longer, and started off again to roam the world in search of adventure. Chapter III. How Captain John Smith won his spurs. He journeyed across France to join the armies fighting the Turks, but was robbed on the way by false companions, and suffered much hardship. At last he reached Marseilles, where he took ship with a party of pilgrims going to the East. A great storm arising, the pilgrims superstitiously blamed him for it, and threw him overboard. By good fortune he was able to swim to a small island, whence he was soon rescued by a Briton ship. He stayed for some time on this ship, taking part in a sea fight with a Venetian vessel, and received, after the victory, a share of the spoils. Now, with money again in his pocket, he wandered through Italy, and then crossed over to Styria. Here he joined the army of Emperor Rudolph, and was appointed captain of a company of cavalry, and did good service. During the siege of the town of Rigal, the Turks, who held it, challenged any captain among the besiegers to come out and fight one of their champions. Captain John Smith was chosen to meet the Turk, and on a field before the town they fought, and the Turk was beaten and lost his head. On the next day another Turk challenged the victor and was also overthrown. And then came still a third, who, after a desperate battle, met the same fate as the other two. For this brave service, Prince Sigismund gave the captain a coat of arms with 3 Turks' heads as the device, and thus Captain John Smith won his spurs. But after this he was less fortunate, for, being wounded, he was taken prisoner by the Turks and made a slave. In time, however, he escaped and fled to Russia, and from thence at last he found his way home to England again. Chapter IV. Strange Tales of a Strange People. Meanwhile, Pocahontas, now grown to be a girl of some 12 years, often listened eagerly to the stories of the old men of her tribe, who, on these warm spring days, sat and smoked together, and told of the things they had done and seen long ago. Some remembered a white-faced people who, nearly 20 years before, had come to Roanoke Island from no one knew where, men with yellow hair, dressed from head to foot in cumbrous garments, and bearing wonderful weapons which spat out fire with much noise. Many believed them gods, while others thought they were devils. And Pocahontas listened in wonder, ever curious to hear of these strange people so unlike her own. The old priest mournfully prophesied that the strangers, being of some mighty race, would come again from out the great waters and overrun the whole land. Chapter V. The Coming of the White Man. And scarcely had he spoken when it seemed that his warning had come true, for runners, wildly excited, cried out that a fleet of mighty winged canoes had been seen afar on the ocean, advancing like great clouds. Then Pocahontas, with many of her people, hurried to the hills, and there, overlooking the sea, they saw in truth 3 strange craft slowly sailing up the bay. These were the ships from England, bringing a new colony, a band of pioneers and adventurers in search of gold, to take possession of the broad lands of America. Chapter VI. The Landing of the Colonists, 1607. That night the ships dropped anchor in the bay. On the morrow the colonists disembarked, and Captain Gosnold, their leader, claimed the land in the king's name. Among the first, as one of the council, was Captain John Smith, who had again left home in quest of adventure and glory, this time in the New World. To the eyes of the weary travelers, after their long journey across the sea, Virginia, on that bright April day, seemed a land of promise. With great hopes and renewed courage, they set to work to build the town which they called Jamestown, in honor of their king, a town which lives to this day. But after a time they grew dissatisfied, for they failed to find the gold mines they had hoped for, and they became discouraged and quarreled, and things began to go ill with them. To make matters worse, Captain Gosnold, after a few months, sickened and died. Chapter VII. The Ambush. Fortunately for the good of the colonists, who had completely lost heart and were anxious to give up the undertaking, Captain John Smith soon became their leader. Ever active and enterprising, he inspired the others by his example. He vigorously put things in order, and set the idlers to work to complete their half-finished houses, and to build the forts to protect them from the Indians, who now showed a warlike spirit. Next he went off to explore the country, and to trade with the natives for corn, for the settlers began to lack food. On one of these expeditions, when he had gone ashore with an Indian guide, a band of hostile braves, who had been on the watch among the trees, lay in wait to attack him, led by Opakankano, Pocahontas's uncle, while he, unconscious of their presence, gave orders to his men to stay by the boat and keep a sharp lookout for danger. Chapter VIII. Battle with the Indians. Suddenly, in the heart of the deep woods, the stealthy redskins sprang upon him, shrieking like fierce beasts of prey, and in a moment the arrows flew thick and fast. Captain John, though taken unawares, made a brave fight, gravely wounding two of his enemies with his pistols, and protecting himself from the arrows by holding his Indian guide in front of him as a buckler. But there were too many against him, and as he could not beat them off, he tried to retreat to the boat, always shielding himself with the guide. Unfortunately, just as escape seemed near, he stumbled into a swamp and was held fast by the heavy bog and chilled by the cold water. Being thus helpless, he was forced to surrender, and the triumphant Indians seized him as their prisoner. Chapter IX. Captain John Smith a prisoner. At first they decided to kill him at once, and then some thought it better to lead him to their village, that the whole tribe might rejoice in the triumph. But, as one of the Indians shot by the captain had in the meantime died, the more impatient clamored for speedy vengeance, so they bound him to a tree to use as a target. Now, as the arrows began to strike dangerously near, Captain John, ever quick-witted and resourceful, brought forth his pocket compass and showed the Indians the dancing needle, and when they found they could not touch it, because of the glass, they were amazed, for of course they had never seen glass before, and could not understand it. A feeling of awe crept over them. They thought him a magician, and were afraid to kill him. So at last they marched him off in their midst, through the forest, to consult with the rest of the tribe as to what should be done with him. Chapter X. The Dance of Victory. They carried their prisoner from village to village, while at every moment he looked for death, until at last they came to their great town, Werowocomo, where King Powhatan lived. And here they celebrated their victory by savage pomps and conjurations. They tied the captain to the ceremonial stake, then, all painted and decorated in their fiercest and most hideous war paint and trappings, they danced their wild dance of triumph. Shouting and jumping, they brandished their war clubs in his face, whirling round and round their captive, like so many demons, each more frightful than the other. But, since they did not kill him at once, Captain John, nothing daunted, kept them wondering, by telling strange stories of the sun, the stars, and the world over the sea, and though the Indians could understand but little, they hesitated, one day feasting him, and the next threatening to kill. Now Pocahontas felt sorry for the handsome young stranger, and was drawn to him, and taught him many words of the Indian tongue, and he told her of his people beyond the sea as best he could, and so they became good friends. Chapters XI and XII. Pocahontas saves Captain John Smith's life. At last, after long deliberation, the Indians decided that, since he had killed one of their tribe, Captain John must die, for this was their law. So they dragged him, bound, before the great chief Powhatan, who sat in mighty state surrounded by his warriors. They stretched the prisoner on the ground, with his head on a large stone, to beat out his brains with their cruel clubs. And it seemed as though at last the gallant captain's time had come. But just as the Indian brave was about to strike, his great war club swinging high in the air, Pocahontas rushed forward and threw herself between him and his victim. With her own body she shielded the captain from harm, for her heart was moved to pity for the stranger, and she could not bear that he should die. And now aroused, with flashing eyes she waved the executioner back. Then she pleaded with her father that the captive's life be spared. At once there was wild confusion of shouting and threatening, many crying, "Kill! Kill!" while but few were willing to spare his life, for the Indians feared the white men, and wished to drive them from the land. But Pocahontas, as princess of the tribe, claimed her right and would not yield them up their victim. Then Powhatan, who ruled them all, raised his hand and stopped their clamor. In sullen silence the angry warriors awaited his decision. For a moment he hesitated, and the fate of Captain John hung wavering in the balance. Then, to please his favorite daughter, whom he dearly loved, he decreed that she should have her will. "Let Pocahontas keep the stranger as her own, to make her toys," he said. For Captain John, during the idle days of weary captivity, had often whittled curious playthings for the little maid. And thus was Captain John Smith's life saved by the gentle Indian girl, and with it the Jamestown colony, for without their sturdy and resourceful leader the settlers would have lost courage and abandoned the town. Chapter 13. Captain John Smith again free. Now, after much feasting, and with savage rite and ceremony, Powhatan adopted the captain into the tribe and made him a chief, and told him that he might come and go in safety as one of them, then gave him guides to take him back to Jamestown, that the red man and the white should henceforth be friends, since Pocahontas willed it so. And Captain John thanked the maiden for the great service she had done him, and, like a gallant knight of old, bent his knee and kissed her hand as he bade her good bye. Once again in Jamestown, he found the colony in disorder and panic. All were on the point of sailing for home, completely disheartened, for they thought him dead, and feared the Indians. But again he put life into the enterprise, and set the faint-hearted to work, freed from the fear of Indian attack, since Pocahontas stood his friend. Chapter 14. Pocahontas brings food to the colonists. Later, when the settlers were in sore straits for food, for they were improvident and managed badly, Pocahontas, always generous and friendly, learning of their needs, came with her brother Nantequias and her Indians, bringing corn, and kept them from starving, while their own was growing. Captain John in return gave her beads and trinkets to deck herself, and called her his child, and a firm friendship grew between them. Often she came and went, bringing peace and welcome food, quite at home in the little streets of Jamestown. And Captain John Smith in his writings had said that without her help in times of dire need, and without her influence for peace, the feeble colony must surely have perished, either by famine or by the hands of her savage kindred. Much we owe to the Indian maid, who helped so greatly in the early struggles of the founders of this great nation. Chapter 15. Captain John Smith goes in search of corn. This pleasant state, however, did not last, for as the settlers became more firmly fixed in the land, the Indians, fickle and changeable, grew jealous and resented their intrusion, and refused to sell corn, hoping by this means to force them away. Once, when Captain John Smith was compelled to go to them in search of food in the dead of winter, and to break his way through the ice of the frozen river, they received him coldly, with lowering looks, and only Pocahontas bade him welcome. Finally, Powhatan joined the discontented, and plotted to destroy Captain John and his friends by treachery. Chapter 16. Pocahontas's warning. To carry out his plan, the crafty chief proposed to the captain that, as now they were all friends, he and his party should leave their weapons in the boat. He hoped thus to attack the white men while they were unarmed. But Captain John was too cautious a soldier to agree to this, and answered that, since, as Powhatan had well said, they were all friends, there could be no harm in keeping their guns with them, as the settlers considered them a part of their dress. Then Powhatan planned to surprise them by night. But, just as his trap was well laid, Pocahontas, risking her own life, stole silently through the deep woods in the dark, cold night to the captain's tent, and, with tears in her eyes, warned him of his danger, urging him to fly. Thus forewarned he was on his guard, and with his soldiers beat back his enemies when they came, and even forced them to bring the much-needed corn by threatening to destroy their village. And so Pocahontas saved Captain John Smith's life for the second time. Chapter 17. Captain John Smith sails for England. Always watchful and brave, Captain John Smith worked zealously to make the colony a success. One day, while returning from treating with the Indians for a new and better site for Jamestown, he was seriously injured by the accidental explosion of a bag of gunpowder in his boat. His clothes were set on fire, and he had to throw himself into the river to escape being burned to death. His wounds were so grievous that he could no longer govern the colony, and was forced to sail for England in a ship just leaving to seek the help of a surgeon. On that day Pocahontas, having heard of the accident, came to the town with Nantequas to see him. They were only in time to watch the ship bearing Captain John sail away toward the open sea. Pocahontas little dreamed that years would pass before they should meet again. Chapter 18. Pocahontas is captured by Argall. From this day, having lost their leader, things went badly with the Jamestown colonists, for the dissatisfied Indians, no longer fearing the heavy hand of Captain John Smith, attacked the settlers and caused them serious losses. And Pocahontas came no more, but waited for his coming again, and waited in vain. So time passed, and at last she heard that he was dead, for this was the rumor in the land. And she grieved deeply, and sat often alone thinking of him, for she had grown to love her warrior captain. Some 2 years after Captain John's departure came Argall, an unscrupulous man, who plotted to capture Pocahontas and hold her as a hostage to keep the fighting savages quiet. With the help of 2 treacherous Indians she was induced to come on board his ship, and once there was seized and held prisoner. Powhatan mourned his daughter's loss, and tried to ransom her, but the crafty Argall would not give her up. Chapter 19. The marriage of Pocahontas. She was never allowed to go back to her people, though Nantequas came often to see her at Jamestown, and here she grew to be a woman, and learned the ways of the English women, and dressed as they did. At last a young Englishman, John Rolfe, captivated by her dark beauty and gentle ways, wooed the Indian maid, and as years had passed since Captain John had gone away, and she had long since thought him dead, she listened to Rolfe, and consented to marry him, that peace might reign between her people and the white men. So they were married in the Jamestown church, and Nantequas and a body of chiefs from her tribe, as well as all the settlers, came to the wedding. There was great joy in the town, for now the colonists felt that a good understanding with the Indians was at last established, and Pocahontas, as before, was the tie that bound them. Chapter 20. The landing of Pocahontas in England. After this the colony prospered. Pocahontas became contented with her life in the town, and in time a son was born to her. Later Rolfe, with his wife and child, sailed to visit England. Pocahontas marveled much at the extent of the great sea and the many ships upon its waves. When they arrived at Plymouth, the governor of the town came down to bid the Indian princess welcome to England. With her as attendant went Audiobooks, a shrewd old chief, who, in his war feathers and Indian robes, attracted much attention. He had been sent by Powhatan to count the English, that he might learn their strength, and he was to cut a notch in a stick for every man he saw. He worked hard and fast, but a whole bundle of sticks was notched before he got even to London, where, with a disgusted grunt, he gave up the task. "Too many," he said. Chapters 21 and 22. Pocahontas at the court of James I. Pocahontas's stay in England became almost a triumphal march. Everywhere she was received with great honor as a foreign princess, and entertained with banquets and receptions, and taken to the theaters to see the plays. Finally she was presented at court by Lord and Lady Delaware, and formally welcomed with great pomp and ceremony by King James and his queen, surrounded by their following of lords and ladies, all arrayed in their rich costumes of state. And none of the haughty ladies was prouder or more stately than the Indian bride. Throughout London town her welcome was the same. The people were curious to see this dark princess from another world, and even the high bishops and the great lords and ladies came down in their stately coaches to visit her at her house in Brantford. To compliment her, many taverns and inns were named La Belle Sauvage, a name still to be found on old London signs. And as she had done so much to help the struggling English colonists across the sea, All wished to show their gratitude by greetings and festivals in her honor. Old Utamatoken received his share of attention as well. In his wild dress, with his tawny skin and shining black hair, he was a strange sight to those who had never before seen a red American. He was not at all impressed by the king and his richly dressed nobles, and wondered how they could endure so many clothes, and greatly preferred his own simple dress, made from the skins of the wild beasts of his forests. Chapter 23. The Meeting of Pocahontas and Captain John Smith. And now Captain John Smith, who, during all this time, had been on long voyages of exploration and adventure, hearing that Pocahontas had come to England, remembered the old times and all that the little Indian maid had done for him, and so, attended by some friends, he went down to Brantford to greet her. When Pocahontas saw him, a flood of recollection overcame her, and she was greatly moved. She turned from him, hiding her face in her hand, and for a long time could not speak. At last she said, "They told me you were dead." Then she reproached him for calling her the Lady Rebecca, the name given her since her marriage, and told him that he should call her child, as he used to do, and said, "You did promise Powhatan what was yours should be his, and he the like to you. You called him father, being in his land a stranger, and by the same reason so must I do you." But Captain John excused himself, saying, "I durst not now allow of that title, since the king commands that you be treated as a princess." Then Pocahontas answered, "You were not afraid to come into my father's country, and to cause fear in him and all his people but me, and fear you here I should call you father? I tell you then I will, and you shall call me child, and so I will be for ever and ever your countryman." And then, when Pocahontas had grown calmer, these two, after years of separation, again sat together and talked long of the old days of Virginia. Utamatomaken, glad to see an old friend in this strange land, told how he had been commanded by Powhatan to seek out Captain John, to know the truth if he still lived, for they could not believe all the rumors they heard concerning him. Chapter 24. Captain John Smith goes to sea again. After this meeting, Captain John became more restless than ever, and soon set sail again. And when alone upon the deck of his ship, he thought often of the Virginia colony for which he had toiled and risked so much, and of Pocahontas, and of her help in his time of need. No doubt he saw again before him the little Indian girl who had saved his life, and the maid who brought him succor, and, when the time came, saved him once more by her warning. And his heart was warmed with gratitude, and he wished her happiness in her new life. But always for him ambition and action called. So he sailed away to help found new colonies, this time to that part of America which he named New England, and where he opened the way for the Pilgrim Fathers, who afterwards built a New Plymouth in the New World. From Jamestown and Plymouth, other colonies spread along the coast, until in time they joined hands and formed a new nation, the United States of America. Chapter 25. Pocahontas longs for home. When Captain John had gone, the thoughts of Pocahontas more than ever turned toward home, and she wearied of the crowded England land, and longed for her native forests again. Daily she gazed from her window toward the west, where lay Virginia and her early life, and she pined, and thought much of the old days in her native wilds, when into her sunny life came the golden-haired stranger with his people, and of the great changes that had befallen her and her race through that coming. She often talked with old Utamatomaken of Virginia and of Captain John, and grew more and more homesick, till her husband became alarmed lest she fall ill from longing, and he tried to hasten their departure. They journeyed down to Gravesend, where their ship was lying, but were compelled to wait while it took on supplies for Jamestown. At last, however, the good news was brought that the ship was ready. Preparations were quickly made for the long voyage, and the day was set. Chapter 26. The end of the story of Pocahontas. Though the ship lay ready in the offing, and the sailors had come to convey them on board, and though at last Pocahontas had turned her face toward home, alas, it was not to be. A sudden weakness overcame her, and gently, looking toward the setting sun and Virginia, she quietly fell asleep, to rest forever in a foreign land. From her son, who years after returned to the land of his birth, many proud families still trace their descent. As long as Virginia lives, her name will be dear to that state. And for us all, who have inherited this great land, this first page of a nation's history, the story of Pocahontas and Captain John Smith, with its echo of primitive days, its romance and dangers, its daring courage and perseverance, will always mean more than simply a tale of adventure of the little Indian girl and the gallant soldier. End of the story of Pocahontas and Captain John Smith. Section 3 of the selected works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chicken World by E. Boyd Smith. Now spring has come, the old black hen decides to set. Though given a nest of eggs in a quiet spot, she is suspicious and hesitates. "I wish," she grumbles, "they'd let me do it in my own way. I hate a strange nest, and how do I know what kind of eggs they've given me? These green ones don't look right." Night, however, makes her try it. "No hen made this nest," she scoffs. "Still, the eggs do feel very comforting. I dare say I can't do better. I think I'll stay." So she flattens down to warm and hatch her eggs, and once interested, even hunger hardly moves her from the nest, and she sits and dreams of the chicks through long and weary weeks, a monument of hopeful patience. Just when she really begins to grow tired of her task, and thinks, "It's surely time, I can't sit here forever," something happens. First come feeble pecks and peeps, then shells begin to crack, and little chicks come struggling out, and long and last 2 little ducks. "There," says the hen in vexation, "I've been cheated again, and ducks are such a care." "Cluck, cluck! Come, chicks," she calls, "we'll take a walk." Then she struts in triumph past the other hens, and proudly leads her brood out into the world. The old rooster wonders whether they are girls or boys, and hopes they turn out to be girls, for boys are harder to manage, that he knows. The old hen finds a new made garden bed of good soft earth. A likely place for worms, she thinks, and sets to work with furious zeal to scratch and dig. "Keep away from my feet when I am working," she warns, and the little chicks soon see the reason why, and learn to dodge and scramble. They all crowd around as she explains the principle of digging worms, and how to catch them. "Worms and bugs," she tells them, "make little chickens fat and strong." Now all goes smoothly, till the kitten, looking for someone to play with, comes trotting up to join the happy family. "A cat!" cries the mother hen. "Children never have anything to do with cats. They eat little chicks. I'll fix him." So she ruffles up her feathers to make herself look terrible, and with a rush and shriek flies at the surprised kitten, who scrambles off in wild alarm through the onion patch. Then she gathers her brood beneath her protecting wings in the open ground of the asparagus bed, and warns them of the dangers of life. "You must always keep near mother," she explains, "and do just as I tell you, or I can never bring you up." The kitten, from a safe distance, demurely looks on, and wonders what made her so angry. Each day they grow a little bigger, and hop and jump and run about the garden. The ducks soon find the water tub, and in they flounder, to dive and swim, and will not listen to their mother, who fears they'll drown. "I hoped that this time I could teach them to be chickens," she sighs, "but it's no use, you can't change ducks, alas!" As they all get strong and full of life, they become quite bold and daring, and run when called, to feed from the hand, and crowd and jostle without fear. Though the old hen still remains suspicious. "I've heard that people eat chickens too," she warns, but of course they can't believe this and doubt their mother's wisdom. Now she teaches them the various chicken ways of arranging their toilet and keeping clean and dry. "Do just as I do," she explains, as she preens and dresses her feathers. "Our family has always prided itself on its neatness." So they copy all her tricks, and learn to stand on one foot and scratch their ears, in a knowing way, and feel very proud of it. Then they go on great exploring expeditions through the garden, and chase the butterflies, roll in the shade of the currant bushes, and dig for nice fat worms, and to get to know all sorts of things that are good to eat. "That's the way to earn your living, chicks," their mother encourages. "We must all do that nowadays." Their little tails soon grow out, and wing feathers come, and really they feel that they are now quite big chicks. Until the wedding rain comes down and makes them feel quite small again, and very miserable. All but the ducks, who quack and laugh in delight, and paddle in the puddles. "Those ducks again," the old hen groans. "They'll surely catch their deaths." As they steadily grow bigger, their appetites grow as well, and they are always hungry, and hail with boisterous welcome breakfast time. Like unruly children, their behavior is not of the best, for each tries to eat as much as he can in the shortest time. "Don't be so rude," their mother chides, then thinks, "Chicks will be chicks, but ducks really have no manners." With summer's advance they grow so fast that they quite fill their box, and the old hen is uncomfortably crowded, especially as the ducks are now nearly as big as she is. "I can't get a wink of sleep," she complains. "I won't stand this any longer. They didn't take up so much room before, but now they want it all. It's really quite unbearable." At last she decides to go back to the coop, after talking it over with the old rooster, who says, "They are plenty big enough to look after themselves," and he finds her a comfortable place to roost. The deserted chicks don't like this at all, and set up a doleful wail, and the ducks are broken hearted, for though big they are timid, and dread being alone in the dark. Now in fear of the coming night they all turn back to their lonely box. With much quacking and clumsy scrambling the chickens learn to roost, but the ducks, though they try hard to climb, have to sleep on the straw below. "Quack, quack," they plaintively cry. "If the cat should come, oh dear, will it never be tomorrow?" As no harm comes, they become used to being alone, and get on very well. This life is full of play, with little care. In fact, their only work is growing. The ducks, now glorious creatures, flap their great new wings, and laughing call, "Now don't you wish that you could swim?" and splash and splatter, much to the disgust of the chickens, who do so hate to get their feathers wet. Autumn comes. The chicks and ducks feel very big, and think they should be promoted. "For we're really quite grown up now," they say, and they have their wish, for soon they are turned into the big chicken yard. Of course they feel proud, though timid. "Now," says the spiteful hen, "we must teach them their place, or they will become insupportable." So she gave them a peck, but the rooster welcomes them all. He likes a large family. They soon regret the garden and their lost liberty, and think, being grown up isn't what we expected at all, and they have to learn to dodge ill-disposed hens. "Horrid things," they call them. The young cock tries to make himself agreeable and get acquainted, but the old rooster thinks him too forward, and tells him not to put on airs. And at last they disagree and lose their tempers, and call each other names, more's the pity. Though the ducks, who love peace so much they will almost fight for it, try hard to keep them from quarreling, and loudly cry, "Quack, quack! Stop, stop!" But in vain, for they come to blows and fight a furious battle, and feathers fly about. Of course the young cock is blamed. "He really is very impudent," says the old black hen. "None of my children ever behaved so before." He is soon forced to run for his life, and then keeps out of the way for a while. In time things settle down again, and harmony reigns in the lower court. The rooster talks to the chickens, now young hens, and tells them, "Now, my dears, it is high time you were thinking of laying eggs. Like the other hens, you are quite big enough." And they feel very proud and happy at being considered so grown up. When winter comes, they boldly struggle in the scramble for a share of Christmas dinner. Already quite at home, they have laid their first round eggs. In fact, they even dream of spring, which soon will come again, when they, like other hens, will hatch out broods of chicks themselves, and so the wheel of chicken life goes round. End of Chicken World. Section 4 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Farm Book by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. Plowing. It had seemed so long to wait for spring, but at last it came, and Bob and Betty were taken to the country for their promised visit to their Uncle John. The spring had come early this year, and the air was full of life and promise again. The bluebirds and robins were back once more from their long travels. The squirrels were chattering in the trees, leaping from branch to branch in their jerky way, and even the woodchuck had come out of his hole to stretch himself after his long sleep. Down in the barnyard the cock crowed loud and shrill, and the hens were nervously bustling about, anxious to set and hatch out broods of spring chicks. And the long winter, with its snow and ice, was in a fair way to be soon forgotten. And now the plowing season began in earnest. Farmer Brown, with his two great horses, Sam and Ned, had been at work for hours before the children were awake. Once up, They hurried through their breakfast, and were off and away to the fields to watch the work. "Gee, Sam, get up, Ned," they heard the farmer calling to his horses. Over the level field, up the slope, came the tugging team, turning up the rich, warm soil in good, deep furrows, preparing the ground for the sowing which was soon to follow. Across the hill, around through the old apple trees, and down again to the low field, steadily trudged the great horses, turning furrow beside furrow, too many for the children to count, even though they had just come from school. After the field was all plowed, the harrow took the place of the plow, and again the team tramped over the same ground, breaking up the clods of earth till all was smooth and fine, ready to receive the seed. "I'll sow that field to oats," Farmer Brown explained to Bob and Betty. The children were keenly interested, for though of course they knew what oats were, they had never known anything about where they had come from. The sun was setting when they started back for the farmhouse. The farmer put the little girl up on Ned's broad back, and the boy on Sam's, for their first horseback ride. How proud they were, and what a fine world it was at Uncle John's! That night, of course, they both felt sure that there was nothing in the whole world like a farmer's life. Chapter II. Sowing the Seed. The next morning they had their cousin Reuben wake them early, so that they should not miss anything. The day broke bright and warm. The tender leaves on the fruit trees were opening out fast, as though in a great hurry to grow and cover up the bare branches. The farmer was soon at work sowing his field. With a long, stately stride he paced up and down, back and forth, scattering the seed with a broad sweeping swing of his arm. When the seed was sown, Sam and Ned were hitched to the brush harrow. This was made of 4 or 5 small cedar trees firmly attached to a crosspiece. The harrow was slowly dragged over every part of the field, mixing the seed and earth together, and pressing it well into the ground. And so the planting was completed. And now the seed, lying in the dark, in the warm, moist ground, would slowly germinate, and strike down roots into the soil, and push up green shoots through the earth into the air, and in good time become a field of ripe, waving oats, all ready for the harvester's scythe. While the farmer was sowing, close by, Mike, the hired hand, was marking off a field for corn, with one of the horses harnessed to a corn marker, a sort of wooden plow with 3 teeth set well apart. With this he marked out straight lines across the field, then turned and crossed them at right angles with more lines. The corn was to be sowed at each point where the lines crossed, so that it would all grow in hills just the same distance apart, with straight lines between, where the cultivator could pass later. Mike explained all this to the children as he worked, and they enthusiastically began to sow the corn, while Bob, with the long hoe, dug a shallow hole just at the crossing of the lines. Betty dropped in the seed. This was their first attempt at farming, and they found it great fun. They did not then know, as they learned later, that this corn they sowed would grow so tall and dense that they might almost get lost in the midst of it. And often afterwards they had great sport playing "Follow my leader" and hide and seek among the tall stalks and broad green leaves, while the silk-laden ears of corn were ripening. Chapter III. Down in the Chicken Yard. With Reuben as guide, the children went on voyages of discovery through the great barns and outbuildings, and every day was like a picnic. Everything was so new and interesting to them. The old well, with its great sweep and oaken bucket, was a never-failing source of fascination, and it would be hard to keep count of the number of times they drank from it the first few days, just for the fun of lowering the bucket and hoisting it up again. But the most exciting treat just now was visiting the chicken yard, for this was the time the hens were setting, and there was of course great excitement in anticipation of the broods of chicks which were expected. And when they did come, pretty downy little things, the children were never weary of watching them, especially as almost each new day brought forth more broods, and even little ducks, funny wobbly creatures, already taking their drinking bowl as a swimming pond. The geese and turkey gobbler were not sure they liked so many children about, but then that didn't matter, nobody minded them. After playing with the ducks and chickens, the next amusement was gathering the eggs in the hen house. Each nest was visited, though the hens protested, and goodly baskets of eggs were brought in. Reuben's mother said she thought some of the hens were laying astray, hiding their nests, for they often do this when they want to set. So she suggested to the children that they hunt through the barns and try to find the missing eggs. They welcomed the idea with pleasure, for this promised to be more exciting fun than watching the chickens. Off they scampered for the big barn. Here they climbed about in the hay, Reuben, being more used to it than Bob and Betty, boldly showing the way. Betty felt rather timid, as the loose hay would slide with her down toward mysterious corners, and there were so many corners and dark holes in the barn. But as Bob and Reuben were doing the same and shouting gleefully, she soon enjoyed the fun. One after the other would triumphantly cry out as he found a nest, and occasionally a startled hen would rush off with a wild squawk of alarm. Chapter 4. Milking. Each day brought new interests. New plantings were being made in the fields and vegetable gardens, and our children were learning all about how to be farmers. They rambled on exploring expeditions over the country, gathered wild flowers in the woods and fields and on the hills, fished with bent pens for minnows in the brooks, and had a good time generally. Tired but happy at night, they were up early the next morning to begin all over again. One of their favorite jaunts was out to the pasture where the cows were browsing. They could stand for hours and watch them comfortably chewing the cud. At first they felt rather timid towards these great creatures with their fierce-looking horns, but soon learned that they were quite gentle, and even got to know them all by name: Bossy, Daisy, Flossie, and so on. Bob and Betty used to wonder what the cows were thinking about, for they looked so wise and serious while slowly munching the grass. Reuben assured them that they didn't think about anything, but then Reuben may have been mistaken. Who knows? The children often went with Reuben to bring the cows home for milking. The bars were let down, and with little trouble the herd started for the barn. They were so used to this that when it was time for them to be milked, and no one came, they would stand by the bars and low, calling for someone to come and open the gate. They couldn't be hurried much, and always took time to browse on any choice piece of green along the way. When they reached the barn they knew the way to the racks, and each cow took her place, some even always choosing the same rack every day. The slats were set in place, holding them from moving about, and the milking began, always a never-ending source of interest and mystery to the children. The cows gave down quart after quart of good warm milk, which was passed through the strainers into the big cans, all waiting brightly cleaned. The farmer, or one of his men, with his low stool, passed along from cow to cow till all were milked. Then they were given a good supper of meal, and again turned out to pasture for the night. Chapter 5. Sending the milk to town. Then the milk was got ready to be sent to town, for each day the farmer shipped it off by the train to the people who lived so far away from cows and green pastures, to the land of the milkman. Part of the milk was put in the bottles which city people know, while the rest was to be shipped in the big cans. While it was cooling, Mike hitched up his team. The children wanted to go with him to the train. "Come along," he invited, and they climbed into the high seat. Now Mike always took time to talk and joke with the neighbors along the way, and often came very near being late. He would whip up his horses, and go scampering down the long hill to the station as the train rounded the curve and came rumbling in. After all the other farmers had got their milk well loaded on the cars, he would arrive just in time to back up to the other side of the train, and while the engineer impatiently shouted for him to hurry up, he still would joke with the train hands. Yet he always managed to get the milk off. With a toot toot of warning, the train went hurrying on to the next station, to gather up more milk, its long streamer of smoke floating behind. From the top of the hill, as they drove home, the children could see it winding its way down the valley. The next morning the milk would be in the great cities and towns, for sale at the grocery stores and delivered at the doors. The milkman, before daybreak, would get it from the cars and make his rounds, to the stores, where people through the day could come and buy, and also from house to house, leaving the bottles on the doorsteps, while inside little girls and boys were still fast asleep. When they did wake up and come to the table to have their breakfasts, they drank this nice fresh milk without ever knowing where it came from. And far away in the country Farmer Brown's cows were calmly grazing in their green meadow, making more milk for tomorrow's breakfast. And sleek pussycats, too, never even dreamed of what they owe to these cows. Chapter 6. The Dairy. Everything was now growing fast. In the vegetable garden the onions and beets and carrots and beans, and ever so many other things, were well started. Reuben showed Bob and Betty how to weed so that they too could help, for on a farm everybody has to work. There are always so many things to be looked after, and done all at the same time. The men were busy with the hoe and rake among the long, straight rows of vegetables, or out in the fields with the horse cultivator, loosening up the soil to keep it moist, and check the weeds from getting a start, for the weeds will grow even faster than the vegetables if they get a chance, and everywhere was busy bustle and promise of good crops. And the sun was so bright and the air so clear and sweet-scented, and the birds so lively and cheerfully singing, that the two children wondered why everyone didn't live on a farm, and be a farmer. They had already quite made up their minds that this was what they would do when they were grown up. The clean and orderly dairy always had a churn for them, especially on butter-making days. Here they saw just how it was all done, how the good golden butter was made from the cream, and finally stamped into pats, or pound bricks all ready for the market, and how the cheeses were made in their odd-looking presses. Betty, like a little woman, learned to churn. Ella, the help, another farmer's daughter, did the main churning and showed her how. The buttermilk pitcher, always ready, easily and frequently attracted the boys, and a good drink of fresh buttermilk is really worth while. Though the children had always eaten butter at home, they had never given a thought as to where it came from, nor how it was made, and now it became so much more interesting to them as they learned all about it. The cows, the milk, the cream, the churning, and then the finished butter. How they would explain all this to their friends when they got back to town! Oh, there was no end of interesting things done on a farm. Chapter 7. In the Garret. On rainy days, which the farmers always welcomed, for the growing crops needed the rain to make them strong, the children had to amuse themselves indoors. They always had the big barns to play in, and the hunt for hens' nests, but the favorite rainy day resort was the great garret. Here were stowed the odds and ends of perhaps nearly 100 years. The great surprises were to be found in the old boxes and trunks. They dragged out old costumes of Farmer Brown's grandfathers and grandmothers, big hats and coats which looked very funny today, and great wide, fur-bellowed dresses and beflowered bonnets. Bob and Betty had great larks dressing up in these old garments and masquerading about, playing old-fashioned men and women, with Ella and Rover as audience, while the cat visited the holes and corners in search of possible mice. Just outside the window they accidentally discovered a bird's nest, with the mother bird on her eggs. It was snugly placed among the branches of a tall cedar tree which grew quite close to the house. Through long busy days the two birds flying back and forth had worked to build their nest, bringing the material in their bills. When all was safe and strong the mother bird had laid her eggs and was now sitting to hatch out her brood of little birds. The children were greatly interested and tried to look round the corner without disturbing the birds. But the cat was less discreet and vigorously tried to get through the glass to catch them. The father bird flew off in alarm, but the mother, feeling that her position was safe, still stuck to her post. And now, though it rained all day, the children found plenty of play and interest between the great treasures and the bird's nest, not to speak of trips out to the barn to see the cows and the milking. Dodging the showers under the big family umbrella, too, had its attraction, savoring of real adventure. Chapter 8. Harvesting. When summer was in its full strength, with green trees and yellow grain, the harvesting season came on. First the hay was to be got in while the weather was good and dry. In the larger fields the reaping machine was working, in others men were mowing, vigorously swinging with their long sharp scythes. The newly cut hay was spread out and turned from time to time, to get it thoroughly dry, then loaded on the great wagons. As one might easily guess, the children found it the natural thing to dive and roll in this new-cut, sweet-smelling hay. But the greatest fun was the hay rides. The farmer or his men put them on top of the high loads, warning them to be careful and hold on. And then away they started, lumbering heavily across the uneven fields, up and down, with many an uneasy jolt. And from their high perch the world looked so different and big to the children, as with fear and joy mixed they held fast while the great load swayed along toward the big barn. To go through the doors they had to duck down so as not to be scraped off. Once inside, the load was tossed onto the hay mows. Then away they went off again to the fields for another load. Toward the last of the haying, the first field of ripe wheat was cut, cradled, as the farmers say, the cradle being a sort of framework attached to the scythe, to catch and hold the new cut grain so that it could be laid in neat rows, without breaking the straw. This was much harder work than mowing the hay with the clean, thin scythe, for the cradle made the wheat scythe heavy and harder to swing. This wheat, Uncle John explained, had been sowed last fall, just in the same way as they had seen him sow the oats. He told them that this was what bread was made from, and that by and by he would take it to the mill to be ground into flour. Oh yes, he would take them along. Chapter 9. The Grist Mill. Some time later, when haying was over, Farmer Brown had some of the wheat threshed with the old-fashioned flail. Though the main crop, when he raised much wheat, was threshed by the threshing machine, the flail answered for small quantities. The cut grain was spread in heaps on the barn floor, then the farmer or Mike beat it with the heavy flail, separating the grain from the husk. The next day, with a few bags of this grain, they started off for the old grist mill, the children being taken as promised. The road was long and winding, up hill and down dale, for this is a hilly country. At last, deep down at the front of the long hill, they came to the dingy old mill. It had seen better days, for now the farmers came less and less. Times and methods were changing. They were getting into the habit of selling their grain in town and buying their flour. In spite of this, the miller was jolly and round, as all millers ought to be. Though the children could not understand the machinery of the mill, he explained to them that the grain was ground into flour between two millstones, and when the work was done they saw it as flour turned into the bags from which it had come as grain. Though this was interesting, the great attraction was the water wheel rolling over as the stream poured down upon it. It had such a powerful, persistent, resistless look. This wheel was the power that made the machinery go for grinding the grain. The miller told them that they couldn't find very many of these old wheels nowadays, as the steam mills were steadily driving them out of business. When they had got back home again to the farm, the farmer's wife began to make bread of the new flour, and after the mixing, kneading, and rising, it was put in the oven to bake, and at last came out in good brown loaves of sweet-smelling bread. "Just now," she said to the children, "you have seen the whole process of making bread, the sowing of the seed, the grain ripening, then the cutting, threshing, and grinding into flour, and now the baking, and here is the bread. Just try a thick slice with fresh butter." And the children, with ever-ready appetites, tried it, and found it very good. Chapter 10. Going to Market. Once a week, sometimes oftener, the vegetables, fruits, butter, and other farm products were taken to market. The day before market day, everybody worked busily getting together the things needed for the morrow's load. Even the children did their share and learned to gather beans, now feeling quite like real workers. The next morning, bright and early, the farm was alive with bustle and hurry. The farmer loaded up his big wagon until it couldn't hold any more. There were boxes of berries and baskets of peaches, with tomatoes and beets and vegetables of every kind, from the beans Bob and Betty had picked to big round cabbages and rich juicy melons. Chickens and eggs were a part of the load as well. The horses were cleaned and groomed, the wagon and harnesses well washed, and everything made to look neat and trim. The white canvas wagon top was put in place to protect everything from the sun. The children climbed into their seats, though they really had taken their places long before the others were ready. Reuben brought the lunch basket, and, with Rover proudly leading the way, they started for the town to sell what the farm had produced and buy what it needed. Along the road other wagons, of all sizes and kinds, joined them, each with a load of garden truck, and even here and there a pig shrilly protesting against the whole proceeding. When they reached the town the streets were already filling and everybody struggling for the best places, and the marketing was going on in a lively way. The children enjoyed the confusion and excitement of all the selling and buying, and the sight of such quantities of vegetables astonished them, for they had never imagined there were so many in the world. After Uncle John had disposed of his load, visits to the different stores were made for shopping, for town supplies were needed on the farm and new tools to be bought. And all in all it was a memorable day for the children, and that night they dreamed of heaps of cabbages and stacks of spades all dancing cheerfully together. Chapter 11. Sunday. Sunday came as a much-needed day of rest on the farm. After the busy week's work and everybody arose later that day. It opened so quietly, without the usual early farm noises and activities, that to the children it seemed like a different day from all the others. And of course it was, for though the stock had to be watered, the chickens fed, and the cows milked, the farm work stopped, and all was very quiet. After breakfast, preparations began for going to church, with much getting ready, shining of boots and shoes, and general dressing up. On all the farms, Sunday clothes were being donned, and teams hitched up. Across the fields came the slow, sober ringing of the church bells, reminding the farmers that it was time to come. From every direction they now came trailing to the church green, in carriages or wagons, or on foot, as might be. The horses, without unharnessing, were hitched in the long sheds behind the church, where farmers meeting were talking over the events of the week. For Sunday it is a great day for the country people to get together and discuss the news, as well as attend service. Everything was quiet and orderly, for though Sunday in New England is an important day, it is a calm one. Already summer had gone and the trees were turning gold or crimson, and the country was wonderfully beautiful on this bright autumn day. Bob and Betty made many new acquaintances at church, and got to know the neighbors' girls and boys, and visits to their homes were added to the already long list of pleasures and experiences. Sunday was especially a day for visiting, and family parties made things cheerful in many homes. Sometimes the children's parents would come to spend the weekend, and Bob and Betty would proudly show the sights and explain things, for now they knew all about it. Down in the meadow the big horses, Sam and Ned, wondered, if they ever do wonder, how it was that they had such an easy time today. The cows grazed peacefully as usual, curiously following the visitors with their big soft eyes, and even the fields seemed to rest. Chapter 12. Woodcutting. As the season steadily advanced toward winter, the interest never waned for the children. Though the berry picking was over, always a source of adventure and fun and bramble scratches, there was still the nutting, chestnuts and hickories, with daring tree climbing, torn clothes, and bruises, but oh, such good times! And then the great brush fires, the cleaning up of the fields, to be all ready for next year's work, for this year's was nearly over. Our children had been allowed to stay on a little later than first intended, so that they enjoyed the Halloween larks of the country, such as bobbing for apples, telling fortunes, and best of all, the jack-o'-lanterns, big pumpkins hollowed out with candles inside. This year the snow came early, none too early for Bob and Betty, for here were new possibilities for fun. All the farm work being now well attended to, the men with axes and saws set to work in the woods, getting in the winter supply of firewood, and piling up cord wood for the market. For after all the vegetables have been sold there is always a market for wood. Houses must be warmed in winter. The three children, all in their stout rubber boots, Farmer Brown called them the Rubber Boot Brigade, joined the woodchoppers. They watched with eager interest the fall of each great tree as it roared and crashed down through the surrounding branches. Mike and the other men sawed them in lengths, and the ox team with its wood sled carted the cords off away behind the big barn. That night, this was to be their last night in the country, for tomorrow they were to go back to town and school. The children sat around the blazing logs of the day's cutting, brightly burning in the old fireplace, and watched the pictures in the flames, laying up more memories to tell about to their friends who had never spent a vacation on a farm. End of the Farm Book. Section 5 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Seashore Book by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. The First Row. Now I will tell you how Bob and Betty spent the summer at the seashore with Captain Ben Hawes. Captain Hawes was an old sailor. After 40 years' service on the high seas, he had settled down ashore at Quahog. Bluff and hearty, and with no end of sea yarns and stories of strange adventures, and of foreign ports and peoples, he was more interesting to the children than the most fascinating fairy book. His home was a little museum of odds and ends, brought from different far-away lands, with everything arranged in ship-shape order. The big green parrot, who would call, "Ship ahoy! All aboard!" delighted the boy and girl. And the seashells, which gave the murmuring echo of the ocean when you put them to your ear. and the curiosities of strange sorts and shapes from outlandish countries. As their first day was fine and the bay smooth, Captain Hawes took the children out for a row in his Sharpie. How delightful it was, skimming so easily over the shining water. The shore, the docks, and the vessels at the wharfs were all so interesting from this view. He told them all about the different craft they passed, the fishermen, the coal barges, the tramp steamers, how they sailed, and where they went to. And now, finding them such good listeners, for the captain liked to tell about ships and the sea, he launched forth into a general history of things connected with sea life, from the first men, long, long ago, who began poling about on rafts, to the coracle and the dugout. The dugouts were canoes hollowed out of tree trunks. "Down in the South Seas, the savages still make them. I've seen them many a time," he explained. "And of course, you've heard of our Indians' birch bark canoes." By and by, the use of sails had developed, and boats and ships grew bigger, and now the day of the steamboat had come. "Now, I want you to know all about boats and ships," he added. "I'll take you to the yards tomorrow, if it's fine, and show you how they make them, so that when you go back home, where they don't know much about such things, you can just tell them." Chapter II. The Shipyard. The next day, Captain Ben, true to his promise, took the children around to Stewart's boat shop, where a fishing boat was being built, and showed them just how the frame was made, the keel, the ribs, the stem, the stern post, and how the planking was laid on. How everything was made as stiff and strong as possible, so that the boat could stand the strain of being tossed about by heavy seas. Bob followed it all with enthusiasm, for he was fond of carpentering and working with tools. He made up his mind that he would build a boat some day. And now the captain, having made everything clear with this small example which they could easily understand, proposed to visit the shipyard, where a real life-sized ship was being built. Here they found a busy gang of men hard at work, some with broad axes, cutting down the planks to a line, scoring and beating off, others with adzes, dubbing, and even whip-sawyers ripping logs. On stagings about the great ship, which towered up as high as a house, more men were at work planking. The planks, hot from the steam boxes, carried up the brow staging on men's shoulders to be clamped into place and bolted fast. And how big it all was! This made the children open their eyes in wonder. They had already seen such vessels in the water, but had never appreciated how huge the hulls were, almost like a block of houses, or so it seemed to them. Captain Hawes then showed them how this great ship was built on the same principle as the small boat they had just seen. And now, if the children didn't really understand everything, it wasn't the captain's fault. The subject was rather a big one for beginners. But it was a great sight, and it wasn't everybody who had seen a ship being built. They knew that. On the way home, they rowed past sloops with a strange contrivance out on the end of the bowsprit. This Captain Hawes said was called a pulpit. These boats went sword fishing, and in the pulpit a man was stationed with lance in hand, while aloft in the rigging a lookout sighted the fish. When the boat was near enough, the man with the lance stood ready, and speared the fish as it passed. He promised to show them these big fish the next time a catch was brought in. Chapter III. Digging Clams. Though there were so many interesting things to see and learn by the seashore, it was also an ideal place for play, and just now it seemed to our boy and girl as though nothing else could compare with it. Clam digging was such sport. Captain Hawes took them down at low tide to the soft mud and showed them how to dig the clams. And then the fun of roasting them in the driftwood fire, and the picnic clam bakes, with the delicious chowder. It was here the children met a future playmate, Patsy Quinn. Captain Hawes jokingly called him a little water rat, for Patsy had been brought up along the shore and knew all about things. He proved to be a most valuable companion to Bob and Betty, and the captain could trust him to look after them, for of course he knew just what was safe and what wasn't. He took them on many expeditions along the beach, knew just where the best clams and mussels were to be found, and where the crabs lived, and how to catch them. Wading among the seaweed-covered rocks, they had lively times, occasionally getting their toes or fingers nipped, for crabs object to being caught. Patsy taught his new friends how to fish, though they never got to be as good fishermen as he was. They seemed to catch more sculpins than anything else, and though sculpins were wonderful-looking creatures, they were not, Patsy explained, very good eating. Flounders and eels were better, but Betty was afraid of eels. They squirmed so. The seaweeds and shells interested the children, and the mighty colored pebbles, so nice and round, from being rolled by the sea, Patsy knowingly explained. He showed them how to throw flat stones along the surface of the water until they, too, could make them skip a number of times before sinking. There was no end to the variety of amusements. Every day seemed to bring forth new ones, and the sunburned, healthy children enjoyed it all to the full. Chapter 4. The Sail Loft. Nights, especially dark nights, the children watched with unfailing interest the great flashlight from the lighthouse out on the point. Captain Hawes had explained the use of lighthouses, how they showed the way to ships at night, like signs on street corners or crossroads, and also warned them to keep away from the rocks. One day he rowed them out, and the lightkeeper took them up in the tower and proudly showed them the powerful lamp with its complicated reflectors, and explained it all. Betty admired the bright shining appearance of things, and was surprised to learn that the man himself looked after all this. She had thought that only a housekeeper could keep up such a polish. Another time Captain Hawes took the children to Barry's sail loft, where the sails for the new ship were being made. He had already told them something about sail making, but knew they would understand better by seeing the real things. The sail loft, like everything connected with ships, proved interesting. The broad, clean floor, the men on their low benches sewing the seams of the heavy canvas, forcing the needles through with the stout leather palms, instead of thimbles, and all their neat tools, the heavers, stickers, fids, grummet stamps, and such odd-named things. On the wall in one corner of the loft was a varied collection of bright clue irons and rings, thimbles, and kringles, which aroused the children's curiosity. These, it was explained, were to be sewed into the corners of the sails to hold the ropes for rigging. Here and there compact, heavy rolls of canvas, sails completed, were lying by, ready to be taken away and rigged to the tall masts and broad yards of the ship, sails which later would look so light and graceful when carrying the ship along. The summer days were passing quickly to the children, and Captain Hawes insisted that they must hurry and learn to swim, and with Patsy's help they were at it daily. After the first cautious wadings and splashing they enjoyed it immensely, and before the summer was really over they had learned to keep their heads above water. Not to swim far, that would come with time and greater strength, but they had made a beginning, and felt justly proud of the accomplishment. Chapter 5. The Log Boom. The two children, under the captain's instruction, learned to row, after a fashion, though the oars of the Sharpie were rather heavy for them, and sometimes would catch in the water with disconcerting results. The captain called it catching a crab, but it was all great fun in spite of this. Often Captain Hawes took them sailing in his catboat, the Mary Ann, and one day ran up close to the log boom, which belonged to the shipyard, and showed them where the lumber came from, for the building of the ship. He explained how it had been cut far up in the back forests and rafted down the rivers to the sea. The great raft was now held in place by a frame of logs outside the others, fastened together with "dogs" and chains. Here the children saw the men picking out the special logs they needed, and doing various stunts, paddling and balancing with boat hooks. Some would even paddle off to the shipyard on a log, balancing much like a tight-rope walker. But once in a while accidents would happen, and they would get more than wet feet, to the great glee of their comrades. When the logs reached the shipyard they were sawed into planks by the whip-sawers, or the machine saws, cut into shape, as they had already seen, by axes and adzes, and fitted to their places in the building of the ship. You may be sure the children had to try this game of logging, and they built themselves a raft of loose boards lying along the beach, and while Betty was the passenger, Bob vigorously pulled his raft about in the shallows. Patsy Quinn, more ambitious, and used to frequent weddings, boldly imitated the logmen in their balancing feats, not without coming to grief occasionally, though it worried him but little. Being in the water to him was much the same as being out of it. These were busy, happy days for the children. There was always plenty to see or do. Patsy was curious to know about the things of the city, but Bob and Betty felt perfectly sure, at least just now, that the seashore was a much more interesting place. Chapter 6. The Launching. The children were always hearing about lobster fishing, for that was an important industry at Quahog, so Captain Hawes took them out in his boat to see the fishermen at work hauling in their traps. The fishing beds were dotted with little boys, each fisherman having his own, with his private mark. To each boy a trap was attached by a long line. Down on the bottom the lobsters would crawl into the traps after the bait, and then could not get out. But Bob and Betty were disappointed to find these lobsters as they came out of the water a dull green instead of the beautiful bright red they expected. Captain Hawes explained that they would come out red after they were boiled. Today was the day set for the launching of one of the new ships the children had seen almost finished in the shipyard on their first visit. High tide was the time set, and the whole village turned out to see the event. Captain Hawes had told them that they would soon see the ship floating out in the bay, but this was hard to believe. How would it be possible to move that big mass? "Just you wait and you'll see," the captain assured them. At the yard everybody was eager and excited. Captain Hawes put the children up on a tall wooden horse where they could get a good view. The ship, all decked with gay, fluttering flags, had been wedged into her cradle. The ways down which she was to slide were well greased, and the builder was waiting for the tide to be at its highest. At last the moment had come. The signal was given. Busy workmen with sledges under the ship struck blow on blow, setting up the lifting wedges, and knocking away the few remaining props, then scampered back out of danger. Slowly at first the great ship came to life, then began to move. Slowly but steadily gaining speed, she began to slide down the ways. Fast and faster, gaining momentum, she rushed, as though really alive, gracefully sliding into the sea. Then sped far out into the deep water, where she floated on an even keel. From being a mass of planks and beams, she now seemed to be a great living creature, and the lookers-on cheered her and waved their hats as she proudly took her place on the sea, where she would pass the rest of her life. Bob and Betty were so impressed that even the yacht race they saw that afternoon, though a fine sight, seemed tame after the launching. Chapter 7. The Wreck. To the children, the restless sea with its many changes was a new sight. One day it would be flat and calm and shiny, like a big mirror. Again quickly changing with a breeze to blues of various shades. Again it would be broken with whitecaps and spray as the wind grew stronger. And it was so big! And Captain Hawes assured them that it was even bigger than it looked, telling them that if they went away out there to the distant edge by the sky, they would still see another just as far off, and so on for many, many days before they would get to the other side of the ocean. When the winds blew high and the waves dashed against the rocks and tossed up the white spray, he would take them down to the beach to watch the storm and see the surf roll in. Of course this was a time for rubber boots, oilskins, and sou'westers, such as the seafaring people wear. One day, during a gale, a nor'easter, when they could hardly stand alone, they saw a schooner wrecked out on the rocks. Everybody on shore was greatly excited, and the lifeboat with its hardy crew put off to the rescue of the sailors, who could be seen clinging to the rigging, waiting for help. They were all saved, but the vessel was lost, and dashed high up against the rocks. A few days later, when the storm had passed and the sea became calm again, Captain Hawes rowed the children out to the rocky point to see the wreck. Here the stranded schooner lay firmly wedged among the rocks. Her masts were gone, her back was broken, and her bow splintered in pieces. Rigging and tatters of sails hung about in confusion. And the good craft, which such a short time before had been sailing so proudly, was now a worthless hulk. Such was often the end of a good many stout vessels, the captain told the children. This was the chance of the sea. And then, once started, he told them long and thrilling tales of his different voyages and adventures, and the wrecks he had known and been in. Chapter 8. The Riggers. This life by the sea made an endless appeal to the children's imagination, and offered a never-failing amount of wonderful things to see and learn about. "Now," said Captain Hawes one day, "we'll go over to the wharf and see the riggers fitting up the new ship we saw launched." You may be sure the children were willing. Captain Hawes, who knew everybody and was welcome everywhere, took them on board and showed them everything, from the bow to the stern. And all about the ship was so neat and well made, it was a constant marvel to the children. High up in the rigging men were swarming, reeving on stays and shrouds and no end of running rigging, doing the most wonderful circus stunts in the most matter-of-fact way far up on dizzy heights. The children fairly held their breath to watch them. Out on the yards sailors were bending on the new sails, the sails Bob and Betty had seen being made at the sail loft. The whole work seemed to them a wonderful confusion of lines and ropes and pulleys and tackle. Captain Hawes tried to explain what each rope meant and how it was used, but there were too many, it was all too confusing. Each rope, he told them, had its own name. Every sailor had to know them to be able to do his work. The riggers built trim little rope ladders from the rail to the crosstrees by lashing small ratlines to the heavy shrouds. The stays and shrouds, of course, were to hold the great mast in place. The children wondered at it all, but didn't pretend to understand it, though Bob was especially interested, for climbing he understood, and such climbing was far ahead of anything the biggest boy in his school could do. They delighted in the cook's kitchen, the galley. Such a compact, neat little room, where the most ingenious shelves and lockers were arranged, in which to hold everything needed in the way of dishes and pots and pans. The stove was chained down solidly so that no storm might upset it and cause fire, the cook explained. To Betty, the galley was the most interesting thing about the ship. It pleased her housekeeping instincts, though it did seem strange to see a sailor cook. Chapter 9. Whaling. The city children never wearied of Captain Hawes' stories of his voyages, and the captain, with such good listeners, never wearied telling of them. A perfect combination. He told of how when a young man he used to go whaling. "Of course, you know what whales are. Big sea animals. You couldn't call them fish. Often 60 or 70 feet long as a big house. Huge creatures who lived in the northern or southern seas, though once in a while a stray one had been known to come into the Sound, not far from here." Now the children were really excited. Oh, if only one should happen to come this summer! The captain said that would be just a chance. It was hardly a thing you could count on. When the ship reached the faraway seas where whales were to be found, lookouts were stationed aloft at the masthead to watch for them. When one was sighted, the lookout shouted, "There she blows!" For the whales have a habit of blowing up spray when they come to the surface to breathe. Then the boats were lowered and away the sailors went after the whale. When they came up with him, they rowed as close as they dared, and the harpooner in the bow of the boat hurled his harpoon into the big creature's side. The whale at once made a great commotion, slashing about and beating up the water, then diving deep down. The sailors paid out the rope attached to the harpoon as the whale went down. Sometimes they had to cut it to keep from being dragged under. But when this didn't happen, the whale would come up after a while and start away dragging the boat along at a terrific speed. In time he would get tired, and the boat would again be rowed near, and a lance thrust into his side until he was quite dead. It was all exciting and dangerous work, for sometimes the whale would attack the boat and splinter it to pieces with a blow of his tail, and the men, often badly hurt, be thrown into the sea and sometimes lost. The dead whale was towed off to the ship. Here he was moored to the side and the body cut up. The great pieces of fat blubber tried out, that is, melted in pots over the fire on the deck, and the oil run off into barrels and stowed away in the hold. Chapter 10. Loading the ship. Captain Hawes made the children a little toy schooner which they sailed in the coves along the beach. He showed them just how to trim the sails and set the rudder, so that the boat would tack and sail against the wind. "On the wind," he called it. About this time they heard that the new ship, now all rigged and with all sails in place, had been taken to the neighboring port and was taking on her cargo for a long voyage. As they wanted to see the ship again, the captain took them on this little journey to see the work being done at the docks. Loading a ship is always a strenuous and hurly-burly affair, with much bustle, shouting, hauling, pushing, and pulling. The children, under Patsy's lead, found a good point of vantage on top of some boxes and watched the work. Busy stevedores, who had charge, were hurrying the longshoremen who rolled barrels and carried bags up the gangplank into the ship, to be snugly stowed away between decks. Bales and boxes were being hoisted over the rail, to be lowered through the hatches into the hold. The donkey engine buzzed, the mate shouted orders, and everything, to the children, seemed confusion, but it was orderly confusion, for the work was rapidly going ahead. The great quantity of goods which went aboard astonished Bob and Betty. They had never seen so many boxes, barrels, bales, and bags before. And yet this was only the beginning, for the captain told them that even at this rate it would still take many days to load the ship. When the first of the cargo went aboard, the vessel sat high out of the water, but when all should be in and stowed safely away, she would settle deep down to her waterline. This was where the green and black paint met. All this had been planned before she was built, Captain Hawes explained. The ship designer knew just how she should sit in the water when loaded. There was no guesswork about it. The ship was to go on an eastern voyage. He had often been out there, away off in the China seas, where strange craft came about you. Junks with their odd high sails, their yellow sailors with pigtails down their backs, everything so different from our part of the world. Chapter 11. Burned at Sea. In the evenings, as Captain Hawes sat smoking his pipe, he would tell the children of strange lands he had visited in his voyages, and then suggest that they look up these places in their geographies, and this study, which before was a task, took on a new interest for Bob and Betty. China and Greenland now meant so much more. Telling about Iceland and Greenland, he said that up there in those parts, where almost everything that wasn't snow was ice, certain animals lived which couldn't be found anywhere else, like the big white polar bear and the walrus. "Why, we know a polar bear," Betty broke in. Why, of course, he was an old acquaintance. They had often seen him in Central Park. "Well, now, that's good," said the captain. "Now you'll remember where he came from. I've been up his way more than once." Often whalers chased the right whale away up there, dangerous seas to work in, as icebergs were plenty, and the risk of striking them in the fog was great. But the thing which sailors dreaded most was fire at sea. This seldom happened, but when it did, it was bad. Once his ship was burned at night among the icebergs. There was nothing to do but take the boats and escape to shore, which luckily was near. They lost everything but the clothes they wore, and a small amount of provisions. And there, while they looked on, the ship went up in a sheet of flame, and that was the last of her. The captain said they felt pretty blue and lonely out there far away from the rest of the world, with no means to get away but the small boats. Fortunately, they soon managed to reach an Eskimo village. These Eskimos are the natives who live there always, short people, dressed all in heavy, warm furs, who build themselves snow houses, where in the coldest weather they keep comfortably warm. They live by hunting and fishing. They spear seals from their skin canoes, kayaks, and fish through holes in the ice. These are the people you hear the explorers tell about when they go on expeditions to the North Pole. Captain Hawes thought they were the strangest people he had ever met. As whalers often put in up in these parts, the captain and his mates did not have too hard a time, and were picked up by a passing ship and brought home. Chapter 12. The ship sails away. Summer was passing quickly now, and it would soon be time for the long vacation to come to an end. Before they had to go, the Sachem, that was the name of the new ship, was ready to put to sea. The children had admired her figurehead, an Indian chief, gilded and painted in bright colors. The ship had taken on her whole cargo, the hatches were closed, and everything made tight and taut for her long voyage. She was bound for the Far East, the captain told them. First she would touch at some South American ports, then go across the ocean to Africa, stopping at Cape Town and other less important ports, then around the Cape and up the Indian Ocean to India, then to China and Japan. With the goods she had taken aboard, she would trade with different ports, either selling or exchanging what she had for the things made or raised in those faraway countries, which she would bring back home to sell in our markets. This was the way, Captain Hawes explained, that we got many good things that we couldn't raise in our own country. The day the ship sailed, everybody turned out to wish her a good voyage. With all sails set, she was a beautiful sight. A gentle land breeze filled her sails, and slowly and gracefully she drew away, headed for the open sea. The steamers and the tugs in the bay whistled salutes. Captain Hawes, with a sigh, told the children that probably that was the last square-rigged ship they were likely to see leaving this port, as the old-style ship was now almost a thing of the past. The fore and aft rig was more practical and generally used where sailing vessels were still employed, but even they were all giving way before steam. Nowadays steamers, freighters, did nearly all the carrying trade. They watched the ship till far, far away, as the sun was setting, she showed as a small black spot on the horizon. And now it was time to leave Quahog, for this summer vacation was ended. At home again, they were just in time to see the review of the country's war fleet on the Hudson. This was the latest development of sea power, great, massive steel ships with no sails, driven by steam. They were grandly impressive, but just wait till you hear Bob and Betty tell of Quahog, and then you will know what ships with sails mean. End of the Seashore Book. Section 6 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Railroad Book by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. On the Fence. This year the railroad built a new spur of track which ran close behind the fence of Bob and Betty's garden, and the children were keenly interested in the work as it advanced day by day. Gangs of swarthy Italian laborers, in the charge of Irish bosses, vigorously wielded shovel and pick, cutting through knolls and leveling the ground. Then the wooden sleepers were laid and the steel tracks spiked down upon them. The busy handcar, going back and forth, excited Bob and Betty's admiration. Bob tried hard to make his express wagon into one, but somehow it wouldn't work. Of course they asked many questions, and were told all about the first railroad, away off in England, long ago, and how from that start railroads sprang up everywhere, and now ran to pretty nearly all the places in their geographies. How the trains brought to the people of the cities food, wheat and meat from the great plains of the West, so far away, till the subject of railroads became to Bob and Betty as interesting as a real fairy story. When the first train ran over the new track, great was the children's enthusiasm. They felt as though it was their own train. They made themselves a good lookout on the back fence and climbed up on boxes they had arranged in steps. And whenever the toot toot of the engine was heard afar off, they dropped everything and ran to their lookout. They got to know the engines by their whistles, and knew the freight train by its sound. They could always tell you whether it was a passenger or a freight train coming. Their admiration for the brakeman was whole-hearted as they watched him wave his arms as a signal to go ahead, back, etc., and occasionally flag another train to stop, to give some instruction. He was the hero of the car tops. And now railroad became the popular game. Bob was the engine and puffed and stamped, with choo-choo getting up steam, while Betty in the express wagon was passenger and train. They didn't forget the flags, and by this time knew just what each was used for. They could tell you that the engine with white flags on top was an extra, a special, and of course green flags were always flying on the rear of trains. The red flag, as everybody knew, meant stop. Chapter 2. Getting Acquainted. This new interest, the railroad, outdid the farm and seashore in excitement. The thundering rush of the express train was always rather alarming, though fascinating. And the slow and deliberate freights, which often stopped on the switch to let some other train go by, were an endless source of interest. Coal cars, cattle cars, cars loaded with everything imaginable, from trees to wagons and carriages, and cars from many different railroads, all mixed in the same train. But the caboose was the car the children fell in love with. Here the trainmen lived, had their stove and beds, and the lookout on top where they could oversee the whole train. Daring brakemen freely walked along the tops of the cars, their blouses blowing in the wind. Ah, this was real romance. Bob knew what he was going to be when he grew up. Betty, alas, couldn't fit into the scheme, though she longed to. Gradually the children were tempted to go out through their back gate. It was so handy, though old Uncle Eben, the gardener, was nervous about it. They got acquainted with the train crews, and watched the engineer oil his great shiny monster of an engine with that fascinating long-snouted oil can. The hissing clouds of steam were rather disconcerting at times, but Bob and Betty soon learned to know where they came from, and could avoid those danger spots. They were curious to know what was in those two big domes on top of the boiler. The engineer explained that they held sand, which was led by pipes down in front of the big driving wheels to be used when needed on the slippery rails. Finding them so interested, he showed them all around the engine and explained the different parts. But I am not sure that Bob and Betty understood it all. Bob, at any rate, while waiting for the next train, now had to oil his engine as he had seen the engineer do. Of course it was the same express wagon, and the watering can had to take the place of the engineer's oil can. Still, that was the best he could do, and it gave the idea. Chapter 3. The Ride in the Cab. One day they had a real treat, one that few children ever know. The engineer invited them for a short ride in the cab, just down to the water tank. It seemed too much like a dream to be true. They climbed up the high steps, or rather they were helped up, for the cab floor was as high as the top of a man's head from the ground. It was all rather grimy, coal dust was thick, and I don't believe Betty's mother was pleased when she saw their clothes after this ride. But then they only did it once. In the cab everything seemed to the children a general confusion of boiler, pipes, valves, gauges, and brakes. The engineer, with his hand on the throttle, let in the steam and started up. The fireman shoveled coal into the yawning furnace door, and slowly they moved ahead. The cab had little room for passengers, but Bob and Betty, perched on the fireman's seat, were fairly comfortable, though they had to hold on, for the cab shook and rocked in a startling manner. Out through the windows they had a splendid view of the tracks stretching away off ahead, forever it seemed to them. Down by the side of the track was the watering tank, set up on high stilts. Here the engines were given a drink when thirsty. They ran up beside it, stopped, the fireman swung the big water pipe over the tender, and turned on the water. He splashed the coal first to wash away the dust, which often gets in the engineer's eyes, and then filled their own tank, which is in the tender, under the coal. From here it is led to the boiler as needed. The engineer, after lifting Bob and Betty down, showed them just how this water supply worked. He pointed out as well the scoop under the tender, for sometimes the train scoops up its water supply while running, as it passes over a trough between the tracks. It was all very interesting to the children, and they made up their minds to keep a sharp lookout for a watering trough, a track tank, as the railroad men called it. Chapter 4. The Roundhouse. Bob and Betty, now more and more interested in railroads, besieged Uncle Eben with questions which he found hard to answer, and he offered to take them to the railroad yard, where they could see more than he could tell them about. They got permission from their parents, and he took them on the trolley to the roundhouse. This was the place where the engines were brought together, to be cleaned and looked over, and got ready for taking out their trains. It was a most impressive sight, so many of these great monsters, iron horses, puffing and snorting, the air above them filled with steam and smoke. They looked like huge animals, living creatures. Busy men climbed over them and wiped off grime and coal dust, putting them into a bright and shiny shape again, after their last trips. Others looked them over thoroughly to see that nothing was broken or out of order. Uncle Eben met a friend here who explained to them all about the different engines. He pointed out the Moguls and the Compounds, the Superheateds, the Atlantics, and the Pacifics, the famous So and So Flyer, the great freight engines, the Hogs, he called them, the battleships, and so on, for the railroad men have different names for the types of engines. The children already knew the grasshopper. To Bob and Betty, these railroad people seemed like land sailors, a special people who had a world of their own, different and distinct from anything else. They lived in coal dust, and talked a language not understood by others, and of things which the rest of the world didn't seem to know anything about. They were quite fascinating. From time to time an engine would be called for, its train was ready, it would be shunted onto the turntable, whirled around to its track, and away it would go. And so through the afternoon they went, one by one, off to their duty, while others, weary from their work, came in to rest and be groomed. The busy switch engine, different again from the others, plied back and forth, putting trains together, the same trains which Bob and Betty often saw flashing through the night on their way to some faraway town. Chapter 5. The Wrecking Car. There had been a great rainstorm, a tremendous cloudburst, and Bob and Betty heard the neighbors talking about a washout on the railroad. They easily induced Uncle Eben, now as interested as themselves, to take them to see the train wreck, which happened to be not too far away. Here they saw that the track had been washed away, and had allowed the train to slide into the river. Fortunately nobody had been much hurt, so the accident was interesting without being tragic. The wrecking train had been sent for at once, and came pulling up just about the time Bob and Betty arrived. The wrecker soon got his car in position to work. It was specially made for this purpose, and had outriggers, which were slid out and firmly wedged up, to give it a good wide base. Then the great crane was swung on the revolving body of the car, tackle was attached, strong wire cables were carried out to the cars lying on their sides, and slowly and carefully the powerful crane lifted them from the river, swinging them back to the track which still remained in place. All this was not done very quickly. It took a good deal of time and great care, but the big derrick easily handled the great long cars. Bob and Betty admired it much as they would a mighty hero. After the work was done, they got a chance to see it well. The wrecker good-naturedly explained to them how it worked, though of course they couldn't understand it. but they could understand the tool car, with its rows of axes, shovels, crowbars, etc., neatly hung along the inside, each tool in its place, and each brightly painted red and green, so he could keep track of his own tools, the wrecker explained. When the rescued cars were run off, at once the repairing of the rail bed began. Trains of dump cars arrived, loaded with stone and earth. By an ingenious contrivance the sides were raised, and the cars spilled out their loads. Laborers shoveled these where needed. And before the day was over the roadbed had been remade and new tracks laid, and the trains were again running as though nothing had happened. Chapter 6. At the Freight House. There was always much of interest for the children at the new little station, just a few blocks from their own home. Whenever they got a chance, they liked to go there with someone to see the trains come rumbling in and stop with a snort, see the passengers get off, or get on, and hear the conductor shout, "All aboard!" and see him wave his hand to the engineer to go ahead. Then the puff puff of the engine, and the train would start off again. The station agent handling the express packages and baggage, too, was interesting. He was always in a hurry, as the trains couldn't stop long, running up to the baggage car in front. Here stray trunks and many express packages were dumped out and others taken on, while the busy agent answered questions and tried to keep track of everything at once. One day Uncle Eben was sent down to get something which had come by freight. He took Bob and Betty, of course, for they never missed a chance. When they got to the freight house, they had to get off in a corner out of the rush, for a train had just come in and was unloading. The busy men, hurrying as usual, were carrying the freight across the tracks into the freight house, where the station agent was receiving it. And such a variety of things! To the children it seemed as though there was a little of everything, from hens to big heavy pieces of machinery, which the men rolled in with great effort. Here the bustle was fast and furious. These busy, coal-grimed men tore back and forth, got their work done as quickly as possible, climbed aboard their train, and were off up the road for the next station. So this was the way things came from far and near. Bob and Betty had never thought of it before. They wondered how it was done when there were no railroads. Outside they saw their own coal dealer getting in his supply from some cars on a sidetrack, and they began to see what a very important thing the railroad was. It could take you anywhere and bring you anything from anywhere. Chapter 7. In the day car. Occasionally Bob and Betty would go by train to the great city with their parents. Their trip was always attractive to them, the busy day car with its passengers getting on or off, the conductor slowly working his way through, punching holes in their nice new tickets, politely answering many questions, and explaining timetables and connections. His knowledge seemed uncanny. The newsboy cheerfully and noisily hawked the daily papers and latest magazines, just out. Bob thought his must be a romantic life, always going back and forth on these wonderful cars. When the train rumbled over a bridge, the view of the ships and docks below was full of life and variety. Sometimes the draw would be up, and the train had to stop on the bridge while vessels were towed through by little bustling, important tugs. Then the draw was slowly swung back into place, and the train continued its journey, rushing through a black, smoky tunnel, to emerge into the station yard with its myriad of tracks and its many trains ceaselessly coming and going. Great work of construction was always going on, for the railroad life never seems to stand still. It is always changing, new tracks, new bridges, or new stations always building. Here they even saw trains being run by electricity, the latest form of power, doing away with smoke and coal dust, a sort of glorified trolley line, and trains and more trains, simply no end of trains. In the city, down by the waterfront, to the children's great surprise, they actually saw trains being carried across the bay in ferry boats, car floats. Such a thing they had never heard of before. It seemed unbelievable, but there it was before them. They were told that this method of taking trains across the water was nearing its end, as now tunnels had been built deep down below the sea through which the trains ran just as safely as out on the open roads. This, of course, was more astonishing even than the ferry boats. But then the whole subject of railroads was so wonderful itself that they felt that wonders would never cease as far as it was concerned. Chapter 8. The Central Station. When it came near time to go home, Bob and Betty's mother took them through the new Central Station. It was a huge building, as imposing as a cathedral, with its great main hall and large waiting rooms. Everything was arranged for the convenience and comfort of the many passengers who steadily streamed through it, coming and going from trains. Bookstands and restaurants, etc., were right at hand. Conveniently placed was the information bureau, where men capable of answering any imaginable question patiently did so through the day. To the knowing, they were really as remarkable as the rest of the building. Betty bought the tickets, with her mother's help, from the ticket agent behind his netting, another gifted man who could sell you a ticket to any place you might ask for. Then they went down to their train to wait on the platform for their father, who was to go home with them after his day's work. This was not an ideal place to wait, as bustling crowds hurried back and forth. Trains came in, passengers flocked out, everybody in a hurry, while other crowds hurried as fast in the opposite direction to get aboard trains going out. Bob and Betty were bewildered by the sight of so many people all going their different ways, and each knowing where to go to, for it seemed to them to be only a great confusion. They had to make room for streams of baggage trucks, great trucks loaded high with the trunks and bags of outgoing passengers, and express packages without number. They watched them all being stowed away into the baggage car. There seemed to be more than the car could hold, but still more were always coming, and room was found for them. Now, as it grew dark, the lights shone out. Long lines of bright train windows running off in a diminishing perspective continued outside the station by other lines, other trains either coming or going. It was all very bewildering, though fascinating, and the children were glad when their father appeared and they were safe on board their own train on their way home. Chapter 9. The Dining Car. This year the children's father had to go on a long journey across the country, on account of his business, and he decided to take the whole family with him. Bob and Betty were delighted. This would indeed be an ideal vacation, to travel so many days in the train and see so many strange places. Preparations were made, the house closed, and off they started on the day set. Out from the great depot they sped, stopping at small stations along the way to take on more passengers going in their direction. Sometimes they would stop at large cities for a day or so, and then off on another train and away they would go, crossing state after state. From the car windows what they saw was all very novel, and the country and the farming along the line was always changing. At times they ran through great wheat belts, where, in every direction, as far as you could see, the wheat was growing. And here the work seemed to be carried on in a wholesale way. The reaping was done by great machines drawn by sometimes as many as 30 horses. It was all so very different from the way they had seen it at their uncle's farm, where it was cut by men with scythes. Bob and Betty could see all this while taking their meals on the train, for the dining car was just like a restaurant, a fascinating car, where they had their table and everything served just as comfortably as though they were in town. Daily through the trip they were allowed to go into the baggage car to see Sport, their little dog companion, for he too was of the party, though he had to travel in a box. He didn't like it at all, and always welcomed them affectionately. This baggage car was a delight to Bob and Betty. Here were all sorts of things, express packages, from baby carriages to milk cans, and of course the passengers' baggage. And Bob and Betty even saw their own trunks. They had always marveled at finding them in the stations whenever they stopped for a day. This wonderful baggage man seemed to know all about everybody's trunk and just where to put it off to meet them. He also became a sort of hero in their eyes, for of course they couldn't understand how he did it. Chapter 10. The Sleeping Car. Now I suppose you wonder where Bob and Betty slept when night came on. In their seats? Not at all, for instead they had very comfortable beds. The car they rode in during the daytime was in a way something like those bureaus which let down at night and become beds, but this car let itself down into many beds. When it came time to sleep, the colored porters would skilfully dispose the lower seats into couches, then let down the other beds above, folded out of sight in the daytime. Quickly and deftly they would make these up, hang heavy curtains before them, and make a series of little sleeping rooms, each with 2 beds, one above the other. Bob and Betty enjoyed this most ingenious transformation. It was to them like something from the Arabian Nights, and they watched for it every night with fresh enthusiasm. They, of course, had the upper berths, their parents taking the lower ones. When the passengers were comfortably stowed away for the night, trying to sleep, Bob and Betty never had to try. They slept without trouble. The porter would darken the car, and all would be quiet. In the morning the beds were neatly folded up out of the way, and the car became an everyday car again. Bob and Betty became quite well acquainted with the conductor, and to entertain them he showed them the sights, such as the baggage car and the mail car, for on this train there was a car which was really a sort of traveling post office. Mail bags were thrown on board, the letters were distributed in different bags, and thrown off at the different stations they should go to, all ready for delivery. Bob and Betty, of course, had seen many letters come to their house, but they had never known anything about this. At certain stations where the train didn't stop, the mail bags were hung up near the track, and as the train rushed by, a metal arm reached out and gathered them in. Chapter 11. Over the Prairies. It takes a long time to cross this great country, even by fast trains, and by the time Bob and Betty had reached the broad prairies of the West, they felt quite at home living in railroad cars. Away out here were vast stretches which they crossed, white-tipped mountains in the distance. Occasionally they stopped at some small water tank station, where, while a stray passenger got on or off, the engine took in water, filling its tender tank again. These stations were often very picturesque in their surroundings, reminding the children of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In fact, it was through this country that Buffalo Bill, when a young man, passed much of his life. Here he hunted the buffalo, which at that time roamed the plains in immense herds. Now all that is changed, the buffalo are all gone, and Buffalo Bill is a showman. At these little lonely stations Bob and Betty saw here and there Indians selling pottery or beads, and a stray easy-going Mexican with his big picturesque hat. And the cowboys, real live cowboys. How the children did admire them. The cowboy is passing away, like the buffalo, but the occasional ones who are still left enjoy riding up to the train and doing stunts, in an accidental sort of way. But Bob and Betty's admiration of them was all they could wish. The children were told all about the opening up of this part of the country, and how the Indians of that not very distant day didn't sell pottery and beads, but were a most dangerous menace to everyone who tried to come out there, often attacking the settlers, or pioneers traveling with their prairie schooners, their big, tent-covered wagons. It took many years of hard work to change all this, so that trains could run across the plains and bring with them civilization. For the railroad, they were told, was one of the greatest helps in developing civilization, opening up, as it did, new parts of the country, and making it possible for people to come out and live there. Chapter 12. Crossing the Mountains. By and by they came to the great mountains, so high that nothing grew on their tops, and where sometimes the snow never melted. Around among these mountains the train wound, at times along the bottom of some deep cañon whose sides rose 1,000 feet above them. The scenery was grandly beautiful, too magnificent for words. It overawed the children, and many of the grown people as well. Through these gorges the train crawled, at times crossing some rushing mountain stream, or what at a distance seemed but a spider-web bridge, steadily climbing upward. For as there was no way of getting around these mountains, they had to climb over them. 2 engines were attached to the train, and slowly, pulling and tugging, they climbed, zigzagging around and about, always getting higher and higher, till at last Bob and Betty could see shining far below them the tracks over which they had passed. Once in a while they went through a tunnel cut out of the solid rock. At other times they skirted near high precipices which made one dizzy to look over. Up here they might see a lone pocket hunter, with his burro, a prospector still hunting for undiscovered gold mines. Up and up till at last they reached the very top, and then, slowly and cautiously, coasted down the other slope, the engines, with brakes set, holding back. It was a wonderful experience, never to be forgotten. At last came the day when they reached the end of their journey. They had crossed the United States. Here, as usual, they found their trunks and sport waiting for them, and now they settled down for a good long rest. It was out here that they saw that famous Santa Fe engine, the most mighty monster and the most powerful locomotive in the world. It was pointed out to them to show the development from the little rocket of so long ago. Here Bob and Betty spent their vacation, enjoying all the strange sights of this country so different from their own. With sport they passed many happy hours, looking out away off over the wide Pacific, storing up new impressions to tell their friends about when they got back home again to the Atlantic side. End of the Railroad Book. Section 7 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Our Country, Part 1, by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. The Coming of the Norsemen, A.D. 1000. This is the story of our country, a story romantic and of high daring, the changing of the wilderness into a great and mighty nation. Its beginning was in the days of long ago. Out of the north, the frozen seas, the home of legend and mythology, came the Vikings. Restless adventurers, fearing nothing, they hung their war shields to the side of their boats and sailed forth into strange seas. From Iceland thus came Leif Erikson and his crew, the first white men to reach our country. The record they have left us is vague as it came down from the mouths of skalds, the bards, who sang history instead of writing it down as we do today. The Vikings, according to these songs, or sagas, came down our shores and landed at different places, perhaps as far south as what is now Rhode Island. They called the country Vinland. But they failed to make settlements as the natives, the red men, were hostile. So they went back again and left us only the legends of their travels. This same race of Vikings had already settled in a part of France from where, in time, they invaded and conquered England, and long later their descendants came back to our land as Englishmen. Thus, the first to come, at last they came to stay. The red men they first met were a savage people, with a copper-colored skin, black eyes, and long, straight, black hair. In summer they wore almost no clothing. In winter they covered themselves with the skins of wild animals they killed. They were fierce fighters, and lived mainly by hunting and fishing. They had settlements of bark houses, with holes in the top for the smoke of their fires to go through. They also planted and raised corn, pumpkins, and beans. Their tools and weapons were made of chipped or polished stone. The women did all the work. The men hunted, or fought with rival tribes. Here they were born, and of course this was their country. We will see later how, though they fought for it, they lost it, in the struggle with the strange white people who came from so far away across the sea. Their history mixes with ours, even from the coming of the Norsemen up to our own times. Chapter 2. Columbus discovers America, 1492. The next important figure in our story is an Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus. In his time, people did not have a very clear idea of the world and thought it flat, though some scholars said it was round. Columbus had made many voyages and heard many stories of strange, unknown lands, and came to believe that the world was round. He claimed that by sailing west into the great sea, he could, by a new route, reach India, a far eastern country which Europe traded with. And just then the Turks had shut off the way by the Mediterranean Sea. He needed ships and money, of course, and tried to get help from different governments. When almost discouraged, after many disappointments, Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain fitted him out with 3 ships and the men and supplies he needed. He, the first, had the courage to risk his life for his theory by sailing straight out into the unknown sea. It was a brave thing to do. Week after week he sailed, and no sight of land. His men became frightened and threatened to mutiny and turn back, but he managed to encourage them to keep on just a little longer, and at last land appeared. This was our country, and Spain had the glory of discovering it. Columbus landed on an island of the West Indies and set the flag of Spain. He thought he had reached India, and so called the natives Indians. They were immensely surprised to see these strange white men, the palefaces, as they named them. Columbus returned to Spain to tell of his discovery, and was received with great honor. Again he crossed to America, planting colonies, making several voyages, searching for gold, which he never found. Some of the leaders, out of jealousy, became enemies and laid false charges against him. They seized him and sent him back in chains, but the charges were disproved, and he was set free in Spain. Columbus died without knowing that, though he had failed to find a short cut to India, he had discovered a new world, the American continent. And now the Spaniards, filled with the spirit of adventure, came pouring to America. Bold and daring, they explored the country far and near and made many settlements. Ponce de Leon, the new governor of Porto Rico, made a voyage to the mainland, and called the country Florida. Here, he had heard, was an enchanting spring which would make old men young. In those days, people believed the most wonderful stories of this strange new land. He hunted far and long for this spring, but alas, never found it. Instead, he was attacked by the Indians and lost his life, which he had been so anxious to prolong. But he left us the name of Florida, now one of our states. Chapter III. De Soto at the Mississippi, 1541. The discovery of this new world created a great excitement in the old world of Europe, and a host of explorers came to our shores. Among them was one Americus Vespucius, who wrote accounts of the new country. From this it became known as America, named after him instead of Columbia, which now seems a pity. Other countries were anxious to have their part, and enterprising explorers set forth. The Portuguese made voyages to South America and planted colonies there. The English sent out John Cabot, who also believed the world to be round, to find another passage to the Indies. He reached the northern coasts, Newfoundland and New England, and returned to tell of codfish in plenty. And soon, as early as 1504, the fishermen from France were to be found fishing from New England to Newfoundland. That fishing, thus begun so long ago, still continues today. Magellan, exploring for Spain, in the boldest and most astonishing voyage ever made, sailed around America by way of Cape Horn, through the Magellan Straits, and reached the Indies. And though he was killed in the Philippines, his ship kept on, the first to sail around the world, thus proving that the world was round, as the scholars had claimed. Meanwhile, a steady stream of hardy Spanish adventurers pushed their explorations, and claimed the country as their own. Many of these expeditions, after suffering great hardships, perished miserably, but others followed after, all in a wild search for gold. De Soto, a gallant knight, with a valiant army of some 600 men, with many horses, set forth from Havana. He landed in Florida, at Tampa. Here he rescued a Spaniard who had been for years among the Indians. This man, having learned their language, was later very useful as interpreter with the Indian tribes they met on their way. De Soto struck boldly into the wilderness, like others, in search of gold. As the Spaniards were cruel to the Indians, these furiously resisted his march, which became a long series of battles between the men in steel armor and the naked savages. Steadily his men perished in this fighting, but nothing daunted, he pushed on. The Indians in a night attack set fire to his camp, in the dead of winter, destroying much of his baggage and arms, which added greatly to the suffering of the company. But De Soto was too proud to turn back, as his men wished, and steadily marched ahead, to greater and greater hardships, always hoping for gold just ahead. At last he came to a mighty rushing river, which the Indians called the Mississippi, the father of waters. This, by right of discovery, he claimed for Spain, in the year 1541. Crossing the river, for another year he vainly wandered, then fell ill and died. His men, to hide his death from the Indians, wrapped him in his mantle, and at night dropped his body in the middle of the great river he had discovered. The survivors of what was once his bold army, after great suffering, with rudely built vessels, floated down the river to the Gulf, and at last, ragged and wretched, reached a Spanish settlement, after having lost half the army with which they had set out so valiantly 4 years before. Chapter IV. Pocahontas and Captain John Smith, 1607. Though Spain claimed all this newly discovered world as her own, and fast spread her colonies through the West Indies and along the Gulf shore, and far south, other nations also strove to gain a footing. France, by right of Verrazani's voyage of 1524, undertook to establish a settlement in northern Florida. This aroused the jealousy of the Spaniards, who fell upon the settlers and massacred them. In France there arose a cry of indignation. A gallant gentleman, Dominic de Gorges, to avenge his countrymen, mustered a company of men, sailed for Florida, and boldly attacked the Spaniards who had done this deed. He captured the fort and hanged the murderers, placing above them, for all to see, the inscription, not as to Spaniards, but as to traitors, robbers, and murderers. Next came the English, who made a settlement at Roanoke Island, 1585, under the leadership of Sir Walter Raleigh, who named the country thereabout Virginia. This colony soon perished and left no trace. At last a permanent footing was gained at Jamestown in 1607. Here, under the leadership of the doughty Captain John Smith, the colony gradually took root. They raised tobacco and Indian weed, and introduced the habit of smoking into Europe. Captain John Smith was energetic and made everybody work, though many, like the Spaniards, came hoping to find gold without work. The Indians caused trouble. Once they captured Captain John and were about to beat out his brains with their clubs, when Pocahontas, the young daughter of Chief Powhatan, seized his head in her arms and begged for his life. Powhatan spared Captain John, who lived with the Indians for a while, and arranged a treaty of peace with them, which was of great help to the colony. Pocahontas often came to Jamestown after this, and in time married one of the settlers, John Rolfe. And to this day there are people who claim to have descended from this generous Indian princess. Here, to Jamestown, in 1620, was brought a shipload of African negroes, who were sold to the planters as slaves. This was the beginning of an institution which later caused our country endless trouble. While this was happening, another great people, the French, was establishing a foothold in America. At St. Croix, in what is now Maine, in 1605, a settlement had been made. Then came a very gallant leader, Champlain, who founded Quebec in Canada in 1601. And Cartier, in 1534 to 1542, had explored this northern district. The French, unlike the English, made friends with the Indians, and so avoided much fighting. Champlain, in his exploration, discovered the lake in northern New York which still bears his name, Lake Champlain. Chapter 5. Samoset and the Pilgrims, 1621. In 1620 came another band of English settlers, this time to what is now New England. These were people who had left England some 10 years before and gone to Holland to find religious freedom. From Holland in time they sailed for America, in 2 ships, but only one completed the voyage, the Mayflower. Captain John Smith had explored the coast of New England and given names to its waters, a part he called Plymouth Bay. Here the Pilgrims, as they called themselves, landed. Before landing on board ship they drew up a form of government for themselves. This is the earliest written constitution known. They built rude houses and began to plant and make homes, suffering great hardships, which caused the death of more than half their number. But still they persisted. To them, one spring day, appeared a young Indian, Samoset, saying, "Welcome, Englishmen." Through his help they made friends with Massasoit and his tribe of red men. The Indians helped to feed the white strangers. They also showed them how to plant corn, using fish as manure, and hoeing and hilling. This was all new to the colonists, as they had never known our Indian corn before. All the Indian tribes were not friendly. Canonicus, the chief of the Narragansetts, sent a messenger with a bundle of arrows tied up with a snakeskin. This was a declaration of defiance. Governor Bradford stuffed the skin full of powder and bullets and sent it back, and Canonicus, who knew the power of the white man's guns, decided that as he could not frighten the Pilgrims, it was safer to leave them alone. Now, in 1630, another body of English, called Puritans, encouraged by the success of the Plymouth colony, came and laid the beginnings of Boston. And soon more colonists came pouring into New England and spread in every direction. They came to be free and independent, and planted that love of liberty which has made our country what it is. In 1635 to 1636, great numbers, with their wagons and household goods, left the Plymouth and Boston colonies and marched across the country into what is now Connecticut. Here they settled along the rivers and shores, as at Hartford and New Haven, founding new colonies with new governments. Though the Indians had at first been kind to the settlers, these, as they grew stronger, seemed to forget this, and were harsh and often unjust in their dealings with the red men, who, in their turn, became angry. They saw their hunting grounds being fast taken up by these strangers, and found themselves no longer free as before, and they began to fight, and wished to drive the white men from the land they naturally considered their own. Chapter 6. Roger Williams bringing the charter, 1644. The Pequots, a fierce tribe, and the ever-advancing settlers soon came to blows. There was murder and cruelty on both sides, and a bitter war began. The English, of course, had the great advantage of guns over bows and arrows. In the spring of 1637 they banded together and formed a small army, which suddenly attacked the Pequot stockade or fort. They hurled firebrands among the bark wigwams, which were soon ablaze, and shot down the Indians as they tried to escape, destroying the whole tribe. This ruthless fight is known as the Pequot Massacre. So terrible was this punishment that for a long time the Indians feared to oppose the white men. In the Massachusetts colony, though the Puritans had come to have freedom for their own religious views, they were not always willing to grant this freedom to others. Here Roger Williams took his stand for absolute religious freedom, claiming that each should decide for himself. But he was driven out of the colony as a radical, and fled in the dead of winter to the Indians, who took him in. He made friends with them, and even kept the Narragansetts from joining the Pequots in their war with the English. He gathered about him a band of followers, and crossed over into what is now Rhode Island. Here he founded Providence. In time he was sent to England to get a charter for his new colony. This he succeeded in obtaining, and gaining permission to land at Boston, he crossed Massachusetts to Rhode Island. Here, in 1644, as he reached the river boundary, the whole colony came out in canoes to welcome him home, and he crossed in triumph through the fleet to the new state he had created. He asserted the doctrine of intellectual liberty, and founded a state upon that principle, the first of modern legislatures to embody the principle of universal toleration in the constitution of a state. This is Rhode Island's glory. Liberty and independence was the great aim of the colonists who left their old homes to come to this new land, and Roger Williams is one of the most shining lights of this doctrine. He was just in his dealings with the Indians, and so made friends of them instead of enemies. Another good friend of the Indians was John Eliot, who tried to teach them his religion, though as a rule, like most people, they preferred their own. And though he had some success, most of the Indians were satisfied with their wild life, and grew resentful of the invading English. Chapter 7. The Dutch in Manhattan, 1664. While the English were thus firmly settling in New England, and the French in Canada, another people from Europe appeared on the scene. The Dutch, in 1609, had sent out an explorer, Henry Hudson, who discovered the Hudson River. Here soon came Dutch adventurers who traded with the Indians for furs. By 1614 they had made a settlement on Manhattan Island, now New York City, and before long they also made others up the river, as at Albany. They had also pushed east to Hartford. Here, however, they were finally crowded out by the inrushing English. Manhattan, then called New Amsterdam, grew to be a city, keeping pace with Boston. Here all creeds were tolerated, and people came from all parts of Europe, many English as well as others. In those days the governments of Europe often acted much as pirates, and thus, just when this Dutch town was thriving prosperously, the English took a notion they would like to have it. So, without any warning, in 1644, they sent over a fleet of warships with an army and seized the town, in spite of the indignation of the sturdy Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant. He was an old soldier who had lost a leg in the war. He wanted to fight for his town, but resistance was useless, as he had too few troops, so was forced to surrender. Later, in the course of a war with England, the Dutch regained the town, but finally, at the close of the war, recognizing that the English were too strong in America, they allowed it to go back to England. And so ended the Dutch colony in America. Though the settlers remained, and were absorbed by the steadily growing English, many of their names are still known in New York. The Spaniards, the French, and the English were busily reaching out to grasp as much of the great country as possible. There seemed to be room enough for all, yet we will see that in time they clashed and struggled, till at last the whole of our country fell under the sway of English rule. These last slowly but surely made settlements along the shore of the Atlantic, from Maine to Georgia. William Penn, a member of the Society of Friends, often called Quakers, who believed in the principle of friendship and honest dealing, came and founded Pennsylvania in 1681. He bought the land from the Indians, and so avoided savage wars. He named the first city Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. As the English pushed farther and farther south, they were opposed by the Spaniards, who, as first claimants, resisted their advances, and conflicts ensued. These conflicts even developed into wars, where first one side and then the other would attack. The Spaniards were settled in Florida, where they had built, in 1585, St. Augustine, the oldest town in our country. This state they held, though losing it for a time to win it back again till as late as 1819, when at last it became a part of the United States. Chapter 8. King Philip's War, 1675. We have seen that Samoset and Massasoit were friendly to the strangers in New England, but the colonists were not always considerate in their dealings with the red men, and frequent causes of friction arose. The Indians complained that the white man allowed his hogs to run free and destroy their cornfields. To protect themselves, they sometimes killed these hogs. Of course, the result was trouble. As the English kept coming and ever coming, they crowded the Indians back, took their old hunting grounds for farmland, and monopolized their fisheries. From the west, hostile tribes were threatening if they moved that way, till, little by little, they found themselves deprived of their broad acres and penned in by enemies on every side. Now they became desperate, and under their chief Philip, the son of Massasoit, they banded together and revolted, 1675. They rose in a frenzy to drive the white man from their land. Always cruel in war, they swooped down on villages at night, set fire to the houses, and murdered the inhabitants, as at Deerfield and other small towns. From Connecticut as far as the eastern border of Maine, they rose and waged ruthless war. A war which, with breaks, lasted over 20 years, until the Indians were practically wiped out. So desperate was this war that the life of the colonies was seriously endangered. Many towns were destroyed. The settlements of Maine were practically laid waste. The costs of the war equaled in value $500,000, an enormous sum for the few of that day. More than 600 men, chiefly young men, the hope of the colonists, perished in the field, and many women and children were killed as well. As many as 600 houses were burned. Of the able-bodied men in the colonies, 1 in every 20 fell. There was scarcely a family from which death had not laid toll. The colonists were forced to band together and raise armies. With an army of about 1,000 men, in the dead of winter, after an all-night's march through the snow, they surprised and attacked the fort of the Narragansetts, where some 3,000 Indians were assembled. The battle was desperate. Both sides fought furiously. The colonists rushed in, but the Indians rallied and drove them out. By now the Indians had many guns and knew how to use them. At last the white men succeeded in setting fire to the place. The fort was destroyed and the Indians overcome. More than a third perished. The rest were scattered, without food, to starve through the winter. The victory was dearly won, as it cost the colonists some 200 men. This was one of the most important battles of our history. It virtually ended the war. Soon after, King Philip was killed, and his son and wife captured and sold into slavery. A cruel fate for the grandson of Massasoit, the friend of the white man. And the day of the red man was nearing its end in New England. Chapter 9. La Salle descending the Mississippi, 1682. While the English in New England and along the coast generally came to make new homes, where they built towns and developed industries, the French, above in Canada, devoted themselves mainly to the fur trade, bartering with the Indians. This led them to stretch farther and farther west. They became hunters, trappers, coureurs de bois, and mixed with the Indians. This life made them adventurous and good explorers, opening up the New World, but it interfered with their taking hold of the land as solidly as did the English. These were fast forming a compact body of settlements along the Atlantic shore, while the French stretched out in a thin line over a vast territory. They have left us some splendid names of bold men, such as Champlain, Frontenac, and La Salle. La Salle dreamed the old dream of finding a passage to the South Seas, that is, a short cut to India and China. He began to push his explorations westward. He discovered the Ohio River. Hearing of a great river farther west, he determined to reach and explore it. He built a small ship, the Griffin, on the Niagara River, and sailed through Lakes Erie, Huron, and Michigan. Landing, he sent his ship back for supplies. He waited and waited, but the Griffin was never heard from again. Part of the way in canoes and part on foot, through 1,000 miles of snow-covered wilderness, he made his way back to Montreal. Beset by every form of peril and obstacle, pelted by snow, sleet, and rain, in danger of Indian attack, his men giving out one by one, till at last he alone was fit to travel. After 60 days of almost incessant toil, he at last reached his destination, to gather supplies and start back again. Such was the character of this indomitable man. He soon set out to try again. He had left his men building a ship, but they deserted while he was away. After a long search, he found Tonty, his faithful lieutenant, who had fled from the Indians. Now all his plans were upset, and he had to begin his work all over again. Indian wars also bothered him. He had to arrange alliances so that his party could get through. Again he had to go back to Montreal for help and supplies. The fates seemed opposed to him, but his courage and determination could not be daunted. By great effort he gathered together a company with the supplies necessary. They set out in canoes through the Great Lakes. Among his canoemen, strange to say, were Indians who had fought with King Philip. Driven out of New England, they were now to help this great explorer. They reached the headwaters of the Mississippi, and now at last La Salle began his exploration. He floated down this great river, the first white man, till he reached the Gulf of Mexico, but, as he saw, no short cut to India. He now returned to France to tell of his discovery, and proposed to the king to found a great colony on the Gulf and control all the vast West. He was given ships and men to start the colony, Louisiana, and sailed. Alas, fate seemed always bent on defeating him. He sailed too far, passed the mouth of the river, and landed far west, where, while searching for the river, he was murdered by some of his men. De Soto, who first discovered the great river, died miserably and was buried in its waters. La Salle, its explorer, met with an equally miserable end by the scene of his triumph. Both men were fated to lose their lives by the mighty river they had found for us. Chapter 10. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. The colonies of New England, in spite of Indian wars, steadily grew, and became prosperous and settled. They early established public schools for the general education of the people. The Pilgrims, who had lived in Holland, probably got this idea from the Dutch, who then were the most liberal and advanced people. They also got into the habit of forming their own government, and appointing all their own officers at their town meetings, where everyone had a right to vote. Thus they grew to be independent and democratic. Unfortunately, their peaceful development was often interrupted by war. England and France in rivalry were always squabbling, and whenever they went to war, their colonists were drawn into the fight, and each side incited the Indians to attack the other, finally joining in themselves. Thus, from 1690 to 1763, the English and French colonists were more or less steadily at war, till at last England sent a great fleet and army which overwhelmed the French, and Canada fell, fighting valiantly, and ever after remained an English province. In these wars Washington first appears. He led a Virginia regiment against French forts on the Ohio River. At this time also Franklin became known. Born in Boston in 1706, as a boy he worked as a printer on one of our earliest newspapers, which he delivered through the streets to the customers. During the last war he, the first, proposed a union of the colonies. And now the colonists began to feel their own strength. England had always treated them as if they existed only to make her rich, which they resented, and struggled against, with more or less success. Now she claimed the right to tax them. The colonies claimed that she had no such right, and bad feeling was aroused. 150 years of self-government had weakened their feeling of allegiance to the mother country. Born on the soil, as were their fathers and grandfathers before them, they were now Americans, and insisted on their natural right to govern themselves. Bold leaders arose, such as Samuel Adams in Boston and Patrick Henry in Virginia, denouncing the course of the English king, who was stubborn and insisted on new taxes. He also sent troops to Boston, which made matters worse. Things reached a crisis when he sent ships laden with tea, which he insisted they should buy. The citizens revolted, and on the night of December 17, 1773, disguised as Indians, they went aboard the ships and spilled the tea into the harbor. Thus began the Revolution, our great romantic epic, the war for independence, the beginning of a great change in the history of the world. The English government immediately punished Boston by closing its ports to all trade, seizing its government, and sending over more troops. The other colonies arose to the support of the city. South Carolina shipped rice to feed its citizens. Virginia sent flour. The first Continental Congress, at the invitation of Massachusetts, was held at Philadelphia, by delegates from all the colonies. They drew up an address to the king, and refused to trade with England until justice should be done them. They also passed a resolution that all America ought to support them, the Boston people, if force is attempted. Franklin, who took part, was sent to England in hopes of arranging a settlement. End of the Story of Our Country, Part 1. Section 8 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Our Country, Part 2, by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 11. Lexington, April 19, 1775. In Massachusetts it seemed as if war must come. The different towns enrolled their militia and prepared for the conflict. Powder and guns were gathered, and in Concord a depot was established. The British general decided to seize these supplies by the surprise of a night march. He set his troops in motion, but the patriotic citizens on the watch signaled by lanterns from the North Church tower and gave the warning to Paul Revere, who, on the Charlestown town shore, was on the lookout. He mounted his horse and rode through the night, giving the alarm. Once he was captured by the enemy, but released, he went on again, knocking at doors, shouting that the soldiers were coming. Alarm guns were fired, and the drums beat, calling out the militia to fight for liberty. As the last stars of night were disappearing, and the morning light beginning to cast shadows across the village green of Lexington, the British arrived, to discover the militiamen, some 60 or 70, drawn up in two lines. The English leader, Pitcairn, riding in front, cried out, "Disperse, ye villains, ye rebels!" The countrymen stood firm, witnesses against aggression. Pitcairn, discharging his pistol, cried, "Fire!" A deadly volley from the soldiers followed, and 7 of the men of Lexington fell dead, martyrs whose blood called up armies. The English pushed on to Concord, where the news had gone before. Here they were resisted and forced to turn back. And now, along the way, from behind the trees and stone walls, in Indian fashion, the countrymen fought them, driving them with heavy loss, defeated, back to Boston. The War of the Revolution had begun. From every quarter the militia gathered rapidly. Putnam, at Pomfret, Connecticut, jumped on his horse, rode 100 miles in 18 hours to Cambridge, opposite Boston, his militia companies following as fast as they could, just in time to meet John Stark of New Hampshire, who led his in. By noon of the day after the fight, New Haven turned out its volunteers, who, led by Arnold, set out for Cambridge, picking up recruits along the way. And so from every hill and valley in New England on they came, till shortly the English general found himself besieged in Boston by an American army of some 16,000 men. This surprising result came about from the way the people had lived. They were all accustomed to the use of firearms, for hunting or fighting the Indians or French. Every man had his musket and powder flask. They grew up practically soldiers, and thus formed a firm material for an effective militia. But for this universal use of firearms, it is doubtful if the colonies could have won their independence. Everywhere now they rose in arms to support Massachusetts, and fight for what they claimed was their liberty. Joseph Warren of Boston expressed their sentiment when he said, "It is the united voice of America to preserve their freedom, or lose their lives in defense of it. America must and will be free." Chapter 12. Washington crossing the Delaware, December 25, 1776. Once the war was started, the Americans struck with vigor. In May, Ethan Allen and Seth Warner led the men from the Green Mountains of Vermont and the Connecticut Valley against the forts of Ticonderoga and Crown Point, which they took. This was to prevent the British coming down from Canada. From here they brought much-needed cannon for the siege of Boston. At the same time, the Second Continental Congress met at Philadelphia and appointed Washington to take charge of the army of patriots, now called the Continental Army. He started soon for Cambridge, for Boston was the seat of the fighting. Meanwhile, the Americans fortified themselves by breastworks on Bunker Hill, Charleston, just opposite Boston. Here the British, now 10,000 strong, attacked them. Twice they charged against the American lines, only to be driven back with great loss. Their third attack was successful, for the Americans were now short of powder and had to give up the hill. But this battle, though a defeat, gave them renewed courage, for they here learned that they could successfully face regular soldiers. Washington soon after arrived and took command. He succeeded in compelling the British to leave Boston, and then marched to New York, where other British armies had arrived. On July 4th of this year, 1776, Congress issued our Declaration of Independence, thus finally breaking away from England forever. This is the day we celebrate. Through this year Washington boldly fought the English, but they were too strong, and he was compelled to fall back. During the winter, just after he had retreated across the Delaware River, he saw a chance to surprise the enemy. In the dead of a bitter cold night, Christmas night, with great difficulty he crossed the river, through snow and floating ice, and in the morning pounced upon Trenton, New Jersey, then held by a large body of Hessian troops. These were German soldiers hired by the English. His attack was so successful that he captured them all, 1,000 men. Then he vigorously kept up the attack on Princeton, winning another victory. These successes greatly encouraged the Americans. Now the fighting, through 1777, became more severe. The English made great efforts to conquer, and the Americans a determined resistance. Washington never missed a chance for attacking, but still the enemy was too strong. Though one English army, coming down from Canada, under Burgoyne, was surrounded and captured. Through all the long, hard fighting, Washington labored under great difficulties. Congress could not always give him the money to pay his troops, and these troops were always coming and going. Each colony, jealous of its rights, enlisted its men in its own way. So that thus he really had 13 different armies to make into one. Each carried its own banner, even though the Stars and Stripes, our flag, had been designed. The winter of 1777, passed at Valley Forge, was one of great hardship and suffering. The men were hungry, cold, and often barefoot, and only the great character of Washington kept them together. Franklin had gone to France for help, and now, just when most needed, France not only sent money and arms, but joined the Americans, and sent soldiers and ships, 1778. Before this, a gallant volunteer, Lafayette, had come, inspired by our brave fight for liberty. Chapter 13. Yorktown Victory, 1781. The war dragged on and spread to wider and wider boundaries. The Tories, those colonists who did not wish to be Americans, incited the Indians to take the warpath, and there were massacres of innocent people along the frontiers. Rogers Clark boldly and successfully waged war on this enemy in the West. And far away on the sea, Paul Jones, with the help of the French, fitted out his ship, the Bon Homme Richard, and attacked and captured the English warship Serapis, his own ship sinking after the battle. There were very gloomy moments in this long war, when many became discouraged, but Washington, with stout heart, still held his army together and fought on, overcoming every obstacle. Congress could not raise money, troops mutinied, and treachery, and even treason, raised its head. The British, failing to beat Washington, overran the Southern States. Then, when things were at their blackest, there came a change. General Greene, whom Washington had sent south, successfully harassed and fought the enemy. Marion and Sumter, with their bands of frontiersmen, won important victories, and the English were forced to retreat. Washington, keenly watching for the right occasion, now, by a rapid and skilful march, led his troops, with the French army of Rochambeau, to the north of Virginia, before the British army of New York could interfere. Here, with the help of the French fleet, under De Grasse, he penned the army of Cornwallis into Yorktown. He at once began the siege of the town, battering down its defenses with his cannon. At last, when all was ready, the Americans and French attacked together. The success was complete. Cornwallis surrendered his army of over 7,000 men, who, on the following day, marched out between the American and French armies drawn up, and laid down their arms, October 19, 1781. Victory had come to great Washington at last, after 6 years of fighting, for the war was won. Though the treaty of peace with England was not signed till April 19, 1783. Precisely 8 years from the day on which was shed that first blood at Lexington, a new nation, recognized by all, came into existence. Now another great difficulty presented itself: how to hold these colonies together and form one country. A federal convention was held at Philadelphia, which drew up our Constitution, 1787, setting forth our form of government. The different colonies finally accepted it, and today it is still the ruling law of our land. Washington was unanimously elected as our first president, the President of the United States. We can never be grateful enough for having had the good fortune to have had this really great and good man to lead us in war, and then in peace. He truly and justly has been called the father of his country. As one of his generals, Henry Lee, said of him, he was "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his fellow citizens." Chapter 14. Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1805. France, by right of discovery, had claimed a vast territory back of the English colonies, reaching west to the Mississippi and beyond to the Pacific. England now, by conquest, in turn claimed this. The Americans in their Great War sought to protect themselves by taking over much of this land. Rogers Clark, in his victories over the Tories and Indians, gained control of a great territory west of the Alleghanies and north of the Ohio. More to the south, the famous hunter, Daniel Boone, led a band of settlers into Kentucky, and after fierce battles with the Indians, established a settlement. Others followed him fast. When France lost her colonies to England, she gave Louisiana, La Salle's work, to Spain, who held it for 30 years, claiming the right to control the trade of the Mississippi River, seriously annoying our rapidly developing western settlements, which wished to float their goods down to the Gulf. But in 1800, Napoleon again took over Louisiana for the French, which he finally sold to the Americans in 1803. Thomas Jefferson, then our president, saw the value of the land to us and made the purchase. And on December 20th, the French flag descended from the staff in the square of New Orleans, and the American flag went up to stay. This cession of Louisiana gave us an immense territory, of unknown extent, beyond the Mississippi, what is now our Great West. President Jefferson at once began to have this territory explored. He sent out an expedition headed by Captains Lewis and Clark, who made one of the greatest exploring trips ever known, and of far-reaching consequences. They set out in the spring of 1805, and with boats sailed and rowed up the Missouri River. As the stream became narrower, they advanced in canoes, using great skill in their dealings with the Indians, to avoid fighting. On the way they took with them an Indian woman, Sacagawea, who had been captured as a child from her home in the Rocky Mountains. She proved of great help as an interpreter. At the Shoshone village, on their way, where Lewis and Clark were holding council with the chief, in his tent, she was called in to talk for them. She recognized in the person of the chief, Cameawat, her brother. She ran and embraced him, throwing over him her blanket and weeping profusely. The chief was himself much moved to thus again meet his long-lost sister. The Shoshones now gave to the party of explorers food and help. Leaving their canoes, with Indian guides, they struggled on foot over the Rocky Mountains, through snow and cold, suffering great hardships. Their food gave out, and they were forced to eat their horses. Still they pushed on, and at last reached the Pacific. Here they passed a hard winter, short of food and clothing. Then they started back, reaching St. Louis in September, 1806. Their great journey of 4,000 miles, which had taken 28 months, was successfully ended. They had paved the way for the opening of the Great West. Meanwhile, our country had been developing fast. On the seas our merchant ships were carrying our goods abroad. In the waters of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, the Barbary pirates seized our vessels and demanded tribute of us. We sent our ships to fight them, under Commodore Preble, and began to train our small navy to defend ourselves. One of our frigates, the Philadelphia, unfortunately struck a reef and was captured. Decatur, a gallant young lieutenant, in a small vessel, attacked the pirates holding the ship, beat them off, and set fire to the Philadelphia, which he could not save. After more fighting, where our soldiers and sailors captured a town, the pirates decided to leave us alone for a while. We had shown that we could strike back. Chapter 15. Battle of Lake Erie, 1813. Now our country grew very rapidly, both in prosperity and in extent. At the close of the Revolution, Congress had given large tracts of land to soldiers, and a great movement towards the West set in. Here, as before, they met the Indians, who furiously resisted the invasion of their lands, and bitter, bloody wars followed. Harrison won a great victory over them at Tippecanoe. But these Indian wars were everywhere, north and south, and did not end until the Indians, much later, had been driven across the Mississippi. Our merchant fleet grew to be extensive. In 1807, Fulton first successfully applied steam to our river vessels on the Hudson. This gradually caused a real revolution in shipbuilding. Just then England and France began warring again, and both preyed on our merchant ships. To make matters worse, England arrogantly claimed the right to take sailors from our ships, giving the excuse that they were deserters from her navy. She carried on this outrage so long that we were at last forced to go to war, 1812. On the sea our ships were gloriously successful, defeating and capturing the British frigates at almost every meeting. On land, where our army was small and untrained, we were not so happy. In the struggle for supremacy of the Great Lakes, Perry built a fleet of ships at Erie. He floated it across the bar into Lake Erie with flats, called camels, after removing the guns. As soon as he found the English fleet, he attacked it, leading with the Lawrence, and fought against great odds for over an hour, inflicting serious damage on the enemy, until, when the Lawrence had become useless for further fighting, he took his flag, hearing the last words of Captain Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship," and under fire had himself rowed to the Niagara, just then slowly coming into action. With the Niagara and the rest of his fleet he gallantly led the attack again, and this time victory was his, and the English struck and surrendered. When the battle was won, Perry wrote with a pencil, on the back of an old letter, resting it on his navy hat, the famous dispatch to General Harrison: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, 1 sloop." This victory decided the campaign in the Northwest, giving to the Americans control of the lakes and safety on the land adjoining. The fighting moved away from this region, except where the Indians, under Tecumseh, fighting with the English, met General Harrison at the Battle of the Thames, where they were beaten and Tecumseh killed. In Alabama, the Creek Indians also rose and massacred right and left until Andrew Jackson met and defeated them at Tallapoosa. This same General Jackson, later one of our presidents, won a great victory over the English at New Orleans. They came to attack him with a veteran army of 12,000 men. Behind a line of cotton bales, Jackson's Rangers and riflemen stood fast, and as the British came on, defeated them with great slaughter. In less than half an hour the English army was in flight, thoroughly defeated. This ended the War of 1812. Never after did the English molest our sailors. Now, here again, in 1815, we hear of that gallant Lieutenant Decatur, who so daringly attacked the Barbary pirates. He sailed into the harbor of Algiers, as that country had declared war on us, and compelled their chiefs to come on board his ships and make peace. And now American commerce was free to sail safely wherever it would. Chapter 16. Clipper Ships and Whalers, 1846. Once again at peace, our country forged ahead. An endless flood of settlers steadily poured westward, till, by 1830, all the territory east of the Mississippi was pretty well occupied. Fulton's invention of the steamboat immediately produced important results. On all our great lakes and rivers steamboats now carried settlers and goods. For 2,000 miles the great Mississippi, the river of De Soto and La Salle, was busy with this traffic. And soon the railroads, just perfected by Stephenson in England, spread rapidly up and down and across the country. In 1837 Morse sent us the telegraph. With the development of the telegraph, the steamboat, and the railway, America changed from an overgrown type of colonial life to that of a nation. Its growth in 10 years, from 1830 to 1840, was remarkable, from 13 million to 17 million in population. In 1846 Elias Howe gave us the sewing machine, a most useful and valuable invention. We soon became a great maritime people. Our ships carried our flag everywhere. We crossed the Atlantic to England with the first steamship, the Savannah, in 1819. Our fast clipper ships reached out for the trade of the Far East and brought from China and India their products, teas, spices, silk, etc., exchanging for them our goods. And our coasts were busy with a mighty ship trade, building and sailing. New England, once so poor, grew rich and prosperous. Emigrants from the Old World flocked to our shores, the land of promise, where everyone had an equal chance. Our whalers were busy. In 1846 New Bedford sent out 735 ships. They chased the whales from the icy seas of Greenland to the South Seas. In those days in our lamps we burned whale oil, sperm oil. Later, from 1853, as petroleum was discovered in our country, we changed to this, what we call kerosene, and now it has wholly taken the place of the whale oil, and the whale fleet has become a memory of the past. While we thus reached out on the seas, at the same time we were ever advancing westward. Fremont had explored across the country to California, which had been settled by the Spaniards. The Americans feared that England would seize this country and hastened to get in first. In Texas, settlers steadily gaining a foothold, kept crowding south and west into Mexican territory. This brought on hostilities, and in 1846 we went to war with Mexico. The war was short, and as we were the stronger, we won. At the peace, California was ceded to us. Gold was discovered in California in 1848, and at once a wild rush set in. much as in the old days of the Spaniards of De Soto's time. In 1849, as many as 80,000 men reached that country, coming from all lands. Half, perhaps, crossed the Great Plains through the Indians. Others, by sea in our fast clipper ships, went around Cape Horn, the way Magellan had discovered in 1519. Sailors, on reaching San Francisco, deserted their ships, soldiers deserted wholesale. Everybody was wild to get rich quick, and in a few years, from a small village, San Francisco became a large city, and California in time a great state. Thus, by one means and another, our country has developed and become settled. Chapter 17. Gettysburg, July 3, 1863. As civilization advances, wrong must give way and right must triumph. A great wrong had been implanted in our country as far back as 1620, when the institution of slavery was introduced by the bringing of African negroes to Virginia. Slavery had always been, and only as the world grew more and more civilized was it given up, till at last only in our country did it still exist. In the Northern States, the climate and the habits of the people gradually caused its decline, making it easier for them to see the great moral wrong. In the South, where cotton was the great crop, the planters grew into the habit of making slaves do all the work, and thus self-interest blinded them to the injustice of the system. Though some of their leaders, Washington, and especially Jefferson, early saw how evil it was and wished to end it. In the early days, the old colonies had always been jealous of their local independence. We have seen how difficult it was to form a real union. Now this feeling still continued, under the name of States' Rights, and the two sections, North and South, instead of growing together, fell apart, weakening the spirit of the Union. This slave system bred insolence in the South, while the energetic North rapidly increased in prosperity and population. As the people of the North now looked on slavery as a blot on the national honor, since we alone kept it up, when new States were formed they tried to prohibit its advance, while the people of the South jealously struggled to continue the institution. The result was an unavoidable clash, ending in a great civil war which lasted for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. On the sea took place a remarkable battle, of a new and unheard-of type. An iron-covered ram, the Merrimac, successfully began to destroy the government warships, then of wood, when suddenly the Monitor, a new invention, all of iron, with a revolving turret, appeared and beat her off after a furious duel. This revolutionized the building of warships, and wooden construction gave place to iron and steel. The revolving turret still remains today. On land a long series of skirmishes and battles was bitterly fought, victory alternating from one side to the other, till, in 1863, the turning point was reached at Gettysburg, where, after a 3 days' battle, the army of the Southern States was completely defeated. Here, though beaten, the Southern troops earned a brilliant record for bravery in Pickett's famous charge. He led his gallant men across an exposed field under a galling fire of cannon and musketry, at a frightful cost, straight up and into the Union lines, but only to be driven back by equally brave men. They were all Americans. From this turning point the power of the national government prevailed, and in time the war was won. Our great President, Abraham Lincoln, had determined to preserve the Union, at any cost, and now, after 4 years of struggle, he had succeeded, and since then we stand united as one nation. This great war decided the question of slavery. The President, by proclamation, decreed that it should be forever ended, and the black man was freed. The whole country paid a terrible price for the wrong it had inherited from our forefathers, but as a nation we gained by sacrifice, and now at last our land became the land of liberty for all. Chapter 18. Railroad across the Plains, 1869. After the Civil War, when the great armies melted back into civilization, there was a steady advance of adventurous spirits, former soldiers, to the new West beyond the Mississippi. And settlements sprang up in that wide land acquired by Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, and explored, as we have seen, by Lewis and Clark, and later Fremont. Travel was by bull team, the prairie schooners, great covered wagons. In the trail of the settlers followed the stagecoach, and then the picturesque pony express. Dashing horsemen, by relays, carried the mail from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, in from 8 to 10 days. The rider, with his mail bag, would dash across the plains; arriving at a settlement, he would leap to the saddle of a horse already waiting, and off again, risking, and sometimes losing, his life by Indian attack. As early as 1835, Asa Whitney had recommended the building of a railway across the plains, as a short cut to the trade of the far East, that East which had lured the first explorers who had reached our country. General Sherman, while in military command in San Francisco, in 1849, sent out two lieutenants to find a way for this, through the Sierra Mountains. Lieutenant Warner was killed by the Indians, for our fighting with the red man was not yet ended. Now, at the close of the war, the government encouraged railroad building by liberal grants of money for work achieved. From the extreme West and from the East the railroad construction began in 1865. The Union Pacific, beginning at Omaha, Nebraska, rapidly pushed west, at one time with an army of 25,000 men and 6,000 teams, laying in a single day, at times, 10 miles of tracks. This work was done only by overcoming great obstacles, among which were the frequent attacks of the Indians, who furiously resisted this new invasion of their hunting grounds. They would pounce down upon the advanced workmen, and kill and destroy, till at last it became necessary to protect the work with soldiers. But the white man was in earnest, and could not be stopped. At this time countless herds of buffalo roamed the plains. The famous Buffalo Bill, of picturesque memory, once a Pony Express rider, now served as scout and meat supplier, killing buffalo for the great work army. This is how he got his name. From the west, with much the same difficulties, the Central Pacific pushed east. At last the two lines met at Promontory Point, Utah, May 9, 1869, and the last rails were laid. The great work was done. From the Atlantic to the Pacific our peoples were joined together by the railroad. The event was celebrated by ringing of bells throughout the land. The results to us of the opening of the railroad were almost as important as the discovery of Columbus, or the coming of the Pilgrims. It gave to us a new world, the Great West, opening up a territory more than twice as big as that east of the Mississippi. Chapter 19. The Great West. Other railroads soon followed this first enterprise, and along their way a rapid development set in. With our own people came countless emigrants from other lands to this fair land of hope and plenty. And within 25 years of the building of the railroad 15,000,000 people were living between the Missouri and the Pacific. Not without trouble, for Indian uprisings were frequent. For nearly 300 years the white man and the red man fought for the land, our country. The Indian at last had to give way. Now, in this his last stronghold, where he roamed as a hunter, the buffalo is hardly more than a memory, and the Indian a curiosity. The West, as the early settlers knew it, is now gone. That great land, sometimes known as the American desert, is filled with homes and thriving towns. Where was once only the wild grass are now wheat fields, orchards, meadows, and flower gardens. The dry plains, furrowed only by the tracks of thousands of wild buffalo and Indian trails, are now crossed in every direction by steel rails. The smoke of busy industries now rise where not long ago rose the signal fires of the savage, which called the tribe to the attack on the settler's wagon train. The fate of that long dream of the trade with the far East is curious. It soon became of little importance, for, with the rapid settling of the country, 95%, almost all of the revenue of the railroads comes from what is called local business, that is the trade with the West, carrying its products to the Eastern States. And yet the railroad originally was thought of for the traffic of the Orient. Now, in our day, this great West practically feeds the nation. From here comes our wheat, our flour, and our meat. Here are raised great flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. Here is the picturesque cowboy, who with his fellows drove great droves of beef from Mexico and the south of our western lands for 3,000 miles in a 6 months' drive, through drought perhaps, and swimming such rivers as were met in the way, up to the north to meet the railroads, who then shipped by rail these cattle to the great stockyards of Chicago, to be slaughtered, prepared, and shipped in every direction throughout the country to feed the East, now the home of factories, where everything else needed for our comfort is made. And now our whole country, settled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, under a form of government which gives everyone a chance to do his part and reap his reward, grows steadily more prosperous and powerful, now not only a union, but a nation. Chapter 20. Return of our troops from the Great War, 1919. We have had a good share in giving to the world useful inventions, such as the steamboat, the sewing machine, the telegraph, and iron ship, already mentioned. We gave also the telephone and the phonograph, with many other valuable ideas, the principle of the machine gun, so much used in war, and the flying machine, and we mustn't forget the ubiquitous and useful Ford car. Not long ago we aided Cuba in gaining her freedom from a Spanish rule she disliked, though we had to send our ships and soldiers to do it. So ended Spanish dominion in America after 400 years. Our persevering Arctic explorer, Perry, at last carried our flag first to the North Pole. We built the Panama Canal, connecting the eastern waters with the Pacific. To our shores have come unnumbered hosts of emigrants from the old worlds. They have been absorbed and made into Americans. Their children, born here, will be as good Americans as any. So that now our citizens are being made up from all peoples. Everything which goes into our great melting pot becomes American. History is always in the making. In the midst of peace, in 1914, a great nation of Europe, Germany, reverted back to savagery, and ran amuck, murdering and destroying. And gradually nearly all the rest of the more civilized world was drawn in to stop this mad dog. Even we at last had to join in the fight. And willingly we went forth to help heroic France in her struggle for life. We had not forgotten Lafayette, and that France which helped us to gain our independence. Splendidly our whole country arose to the effort. Red Cross societies were formed everywhere throughout the land, and women worked to make bandages for the wounded soldiers. Everybody helped by raising more food or loaning money to the government. The whole movement was altruistic and noble, service for humanity. Our young men were enrolled as soldiers, and soon we landed over 2,000,000 in France, who gallantly went into battle, fighting side by side with England, once our mother, then our enemy, and now our gallant ally. And by our help the brutal enemy was beaten, and peace given to a suffering world. Many of our brave dead lie buried in France, but they did not die in vain. Among them, strange to say, were a number of Indians, fighting side by side with the white man. The last of the red men died like warriors, as of old. Our troops are home with us again. The veterans of Gettysburg saluted their triumphant grandsons, and that nightmare of war is past. Our faces again are turned towards the future. Thus ends the story of our country, so far, 1920. Now, all these people, through this long story, from away back in the beginning, were flesh and blood just like us. They worked, slept, loved, and were sick, even suffered from toothache, just as we do. They were our forefathers, we are blood relations to them. If it hadn't been for them and what they did, we should not be here today. Let us not forget, to us the creed of ancestor worship is fitting. Let us each and all, proud of our great past, strive to be equal to it, and take for our motto, Noblesse oblige. Long live the United States of America. End of the story of our country. End of selected works by E. Boyd Smith. Recorded by Barry Eads.